What would you do if, during recess at school, you looked up and saw something not from this earth? On the morning of September 16, 1994, the Ariel School in Rua, Zimbabwe, was alive with the usual sound of children laughing, running, and playing. The air was warm, the sun shone brightly, and the red soil of the playground carried the smell of dust as kids ran across it. To anyone watching from a distance, it was just another ordinary school day. But within a few moments, that ordinary day would become one of the most extraordinary events in UFO history, an event so mysterious, so powerful, that people are still talking about it decades later. The Ariel School was not a big city school. It stood in the countryside, about 20 kilometers outside Harare, Zimbabwe's capital. Surrounding the school were stretches of open land, brush, and thick bushes, where children were told not to wander. It was a safe, quiet place, perfect for young children to learn, to play, and to grow up. On that Friday morning, the teachers were busy inside, gathered for a staff meeting. This meant the children had longer playtime outdoors. More than 60 kids, between the ages of 6 and 12, filled the playground with energy. Some were chasing each other, some were playing ball, others were just chatting in small groups. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The world was as it always was. But then, something shifted. A few children noticed a shining flash in the sky. At first they thought it was just a reflection, maybe sunlight bouncing off a plane, or a bird's wings catching the morning light. Planes sometimes flew overhead, and that was nothing new. But this light was different. It moved strangely, it glided, it darted, and it didn't sound like a plane at all. More children began to notice. They stopped playing, their eyes fixed upward. What they saw made their hearts pound. A round, silver object, Med-2, float above the tree line. It wasn't huge like an airplane, but it wasn't small like a bird either. It shimmered, almost metallic, and it moved with a smoothness that felt unnatural, like it was being guided by something intelligent. Suddenly the object dipped lower. It came down near the edge of the schoolyard, just beyond the playground where the bushland began. The kids, curious and nervous, crept closer, but they didn't dare go too far. Their teachers had always warned them about snakes and dangerous animals hiding in those bushes. Yet what they saw was not an animal at all. The object seemed to land or hover close to the ground. The children described it later as a shiny disc, round and glowing. Some said it had windows, others said it simply glowed too brightly to see details. Then came the part that froze them in fear. From this strange craft, beings appeared. Small figures unlike any human the children had ever seen stepped out, or perhaps floated out. They were short, not much taller than some of the older students. Their bodies were thin, fragile looking. Their skin was pale, almost gray, and their heads were large compared to their bodies, with huge, black, almond-shaped eyes that seemed to stare straight into the souls of the children. The playground fell silent. The air itself felt heavy. Some of the kids were too shocked to move. Others screamed and ran. A few, too curious to flee, simply stood frozen, watching. What made it even stranger was that some of the children claimed the beings did not speak out loud, but somehow they heard voices inside their minds. Words that were not really words, messages that were more like feelings, warnings, and images. Many of the kids later said that these beings sent them thoughts about the future of Earth, about nature, the environment, and the dangers of human technology. Imagine being 9 or 10 years old, and suddenly, a figure from the sky is telling you, without speaking, to take care of your planet. For the children, time felt like it had stopped. Some of them stared into those enormous black eyes and felt an overwhelming sense of fear. Others felt a strange calmness, as if the beings were not there to harm them. But whatever the emotions, every child knew this was not something they could ever forget. When the beings returned to their craft, the object lifted silently into the sky. It rose higher and higher until it disappeared, leaving nothing behind but trembling hands, racing hearts, and wide eyes. The children ran back toward the school building, shouting, crying, trying to explain what they had just seen. Some tried to laugh it off, thinking maybe it was just a dream or a trick. Others were too shaken to even speak. But one thing was certain. More than 60 witnesses saw the same thing at the same time in the same place. That morning, Ariel School in Rua stopped being just a small school in Zimbabwe. It became the center of a mystery that would capture the attention of journalists, scientists, and UFO researchers around the world. For those children, September 16, 1994, would forever be known as the day the sky stopped, and something beyond Earth came down to meet them. When we talk about the Ariel School UFO Encounter, it's easy to jump straight into the sighting itself, the disc-shaped craft, the strange beings, the terrified children. But to truly understand the story, we need to step back and imagine the place where it all happened. Because the setting, the school, the land, the environment, played a huge role in why this story is so powerful. The Ariel School in 1994 was not a big modern building with shiny glass walls and air-conditioned classrooms. No, it was a modest rural school built to serve children in the small farming community of Ruwa, Zimbabwe. At that time, Zimbabwe was still a country with large stretches of open land. Villages and farms spread far apart, separated by fields, forests, and bush. Ariel School sat quietly in one of these areas, surrounded not by tall city buildings, but by nature in its rawest form. The school itself had a few classroom blocks, painted in simple colors. The walls were sturdy but plain, the windows large enough to let in the African sun. The roof, like many schools in the region, was built to handle both the blazing heat and the heavy rains of the season. There was no luxury here, just the basics needed for education: chalkboards, wooden desks, and shelves of worn textbooks. But for the children who came every day, Ariel was more than just a building. It was their second home. It was the place where they learned, laughed, and formed lifelong friendships. Now, imagine walking out of those classrooms in the mid-1990s. The playground was not paved or covered in smooth concrete. Instead, it was made of red earth, the kind that clings to your shoes and leaves dust on your hands when you fall. That red soil is a signature of Zimbabwe, rich in minerals and history, stretching far across the land. Kids at Ariel played soccer on this ground, running with bare feet or worn shoes, the dust rising on them as they kicked and chased the ball. On the edges of the playground were patches of long grass and bushland. The teachers often warned the children not to wander too far into the bushes. Snakes, spiders, and wild animals could be hiding there. The bushes also gave the school a kind of natural border, like a wall made by nature itself. Behind those bushes stretched endless countryside, dotted with trees and farms. It was beautiful, but also wild, mysterious, and sometimes dangerous. And it was in that borderland between the safety of the playground and the unknown of the bush that the strange craft would later appear. If the school had been in the middle of a crowded city, with traffic and noise, perhaps the sighting would have gone unnoticed. But here, in Ruwa, the silence of the countryside made every sound sharper, every movement in the sky more noticeable. The children of Ariel came from different backgrounds. Some were from wealthy farming families who sent their kids to private school. Others were local children from nearby villages. Together, they formed a diverse group, sharing games, meals, and stories. Their different cultural backgrounds also meant that when they later described what they saw, their words sometimes differed, but the core story remained the same. What's important to understand is how isolated yet connected the school was. On one hand, it was far enough from the city that children were free to play in wide open spaces, surrounded by nature. On the other hand, Ruwa was not completely cut off from the modern world. Families had radios, newspapers, and some even had televisions. News traveled. The children knew about planes, helicopters, and cars. They weren't so isolated that they couldn't tell the difference between ordinary machines and something extraordinary. The atmosphere of the school also shaped how the encounter unfolded. That Friday morning, all the teachers were in a staff meeting inside. This left the children outdoors under the supervision of just one or two adults, who were not right there with them on the playground. This small detail is crucial. The fact that the kids were outside, relatively free, playing near the bush without direct adult interference, meant that they experienced the event with raw, unfiltered eyes. No teacher was there to tell them, "Don't be silly, it's just an airplane." No adult voice overpowered their own impressions. The setting also explains why the children were so focused on the sky. In a city, kids might be distracted by traffic, noise, or tall buildings blocking their view. But at Ariel, the sky was wide and open, stretching endlessly above them. Clouds moved slowly across the blue. Birds circled. And so when something unusual appeared, every child noticed. They weren't fighting against 100 other distractions. The school's quiet, natural environment gave them a clear stage for the mysterious craft to appear. Let's also talk about Zimbabwe itself in 1994. The country was young, having gained independence only 14 years earlier in 1980. There was still a strong connection between people and the land. Many families farmed, relied on the soil, and respected the rhythms of nature. The children of Ariel were part of this culture. They grew up with stories of spirits, ancestors, and mysterious happenings told by elders. The land around them carried not just physical weight, but also spiritual meaning. When something unexplainable happened, it wasn't just dismissed, it was felt deeply, connected to old traditions and beliefs. In fact, this cultural background is one of the reasons why the Ariel encounter is so unique. In the West, UFO sightings are often linked to science fiction movies, technology, or conspiracy theories. But in Zimbabwe, in a rural school surrounded by bush, the sighting blended into a very different cultural landscape. For these children, the beings they saw weren't just aliens from outer space. Some described them later in ways that echoed spiritual figures or mythological beings. The setting shaped the interpretation. If we were to stand at Ariel School today and look around, we might see a quiet courtyard, the same red soil, the same bushes swaying in the wind. We might hear the laughter of children echoing across the yard. But if we look closer, we would notice something else. The stillness of the land, the sense that this is a place where the ordinary can suddenly meet the extraordinary. It is a landscape that holds stories, waiting for those who listen. That is why the school and its surroundings are not just a backdrop to the story. They are characters in the story themselves. The open playground gave children the space to see the craft. The bush provided the landing spot. The silence made the event impossible to ignore. And the cultural mix of the students ensured that their testimonies would carry layers of meaning, from simple descriptions of a shiny disk to deeper warnings about the future of humanity. So before we move deeper into the encounter itself, we must pause and picture the Ariel School clearly in our minds. Imagine the red dust rising under running feet. Imagine the wide-open African sky. Imagine the bushes at the edge, dark and mysterious, holding secrets. And imagine being a child in that place, where your world feels small and safe, only to see it shattered by something that does not belong. This is the stage. This is the environment. This is the world of Ariel School on September 16, 1994. And without this stage, the story of the Zimbabwe UFO encounter would not carry the same weight, the same mystery, the same lasting impact. When we talk about the Ariel School UFO encounter, one detail stands out more than anything else. The witnesses were children. Not one or two, but more than 60 young students. Each of them, between the ages of 6 and 12, claimed to have seen something that day, something they could never forget. And when we think about history, we realize how rare this is. Most UFO stories come from single witnesses or small groups of adults. But here, in a quiet Zimbabwean schoolyard, dozens of children stood together, watching the same unbelievable scene unfold. To understand why this case became one of the most famous UFO events in the world, we have to step into their shoes. We have to see the world through their eyes. Children see the world differently than adults. They notice things adults overlook. Their minds are not yet weighed down by years of skepticism, responsibility, or routine. When they look at the sky, they don't just see blue. They see endless space, mystery, and imagination. That Friday morning, the kids at Ariel School were not thinking about UFOs. They weren't reading science fiction novels or watching alien movies in class. They were simply playing. Some were kicking a ball, some were chasing one another, their shoes sending up clouds of red dust. Others sat on the grass, laughing and talking about cartoons or weekend plans. It was a scene of innocence, a scene of ordinary childhood. And that is what makes their testimony so powerful. They had no reason to invent what they saw. The children came from different cultural and economic backgrounds. Some were from wealthier farming families, their parents sending them to private school for better education. Others were local village kids, raised with different traditions and stories passed down from elders. This mix of backgrounds added richness to the event. When the children later described what they saw, the cultural filters shaped the language they used. Some spoke of aliens, others spoke of strange men or beings. A few even compared the figures to spiritual entities. But despite these differences in words, the core description remained the same. A disc-shaped object in the sky, strange small figures with big eyes, and a sense of communication without words. Let's pause and think about what it means for 60 children to agree on something so unusual. Imagine if you asked 60 kids to describe a teacher's outfit from yesterday. You would probably get dozens of different answers. Wrong colors, wrong patterns, confusion. Kids don't always get details right. They exaggerate, misremember, or mix things up. But here, at Ariel School, the children's stories lined up in astonishing ways. When asked separately, they repeated the same details: shiny craft, landing near the bush, beings with large eyes, feelings of fear mixed with curiosity. They even drew pictures that looked strikingly similar, despite being created in isolation. Some skeptics later argued that the children influenced each other, that once one kid started talking, the rest followed. But interviews proved otherwise. Investigators like Dr. John Mack, the Harvard psychiatrist who traveled all the way to Zimbabwe, took great care to separate the children. He interviewed them one by one in private, and still, their stories matched. Not word for word, but in essence, in feeling, in imagery. This consistency is one of the strongest reasons why the Ariel School case is so famous even today. Now, let's zoom in on the children as individuals. Imagine being 8 years old, standing in the schoolyard, when you see something glittering in the sky. At first, you think it's a plane. You've seen planes before, but then it moves differently, silently, smoothly, with no wings. You point it out to your friends, and they see it too. Suddenly, it dips lower, and your stomach flips. You don't know whether to run or stay. Part of you is terrified, part of you can't look away. This was the inner world of those children, an emotional storm of fear, wonder, and confusion. Some of the youngest children were too frightened to keep watching. They screamed, turned, and sprinted toward the school buildings. Their small legs pumped as fast as they could, dust flying behind them. Their faces were pale with fear. To them, the strange figures near the bush were monsters, unknown creatures stepping out of a glowing object. Childhood instinct took over. Run to safety, find the adults, escape the unknown. But not every child ran. Some were braver, or perhaps more curious. A group of older students, around 10 or 11, stood their ground, peering at the figures. They described later how the beings seemed to move in unusual ways, almost gliding rather than walking. Their huge black eyes locked onto the children, and for a moment it felt as if time itself had frozen. Some of the children said the beings communicated without moving their mouths, sending thoughts straight into their minds. The messages weren't long speeches. They were feelings, impressions, warnings about the earth and the dangers of human carelessness. For a child, this was overwhelming. How do you explain to your teacher later that a figure from the sky told you, in your mind, to take care of the planet? The diversity of reactions among the children makes the story even more real. Some laughed nervously, thinking maybe it was a trick. Others hid behind their friends, peeking out with wide eyes. A few felt strangely calm, as if the beings meant no harm. This variety of emotional responses is exactly what you would expect in a group of children facing something unknown. If they had all reacted in the exact same way, it might have seemed rehearsed. But the mix of terror, curiosity, disbelief, and awe gave their story authenticity. The innocence of the children also came through in how they described the beings. They didn't use scientific terms or complicated language. They said things like small men, funny people, big eyes, shiny suit. Their drawings looked like simple sketches, not technical blueprints. This honesty, this lack of sophistication, is what convinced many investigators that the children were not lying. They described what they saw with the only words they had. We must also remember that children, especially at that age, are not usually capable of organizing a large, consistent lie. 60 kids agreeing on a complex story, keeping their details aligned, and repeating it under pressure. This is almost impossible, especially in the days before social media or instant messaging, when children couldn't coordinate their stories outside of school. The Ariel case showed us the raw, unfiltered witness accounts of innocent observers, and yet, being children made their experience harder too. Adults didn't always take them seriously. Some teachers and parents thought they were making it up or playing a game. Journalists questioned their imaginations. Skeptics said it was just mass hysteria, children feeding off each other's fear. Imagine being a child, knowing what you saw, and having adults shake their heads at you. That frustration, that feeling of not being believed, stayed with many of the Ariel witnesses even as they grew older. Decades later, when some of them were interviewed again as adults, they said they still remembered every detail. They still carried the memory of those large eyes staring at them, the craft hovering near the bush, the strange silence in the air. The Ariel School UFO Encounter is remembered today not just because of the craft or the beings, but because of the witnesses. These children were the heart of the story. Their innocence made their testimonies powerful. Their numbers made their story undeniable. And their emotions, the screams, the tears, the curiosity, painted a picture so vivid that the world could not ignore it. So when we look back at September 16, 1994, we don't just see a UFO in the sky. We see a playground full of children, dust rising around their feet, eyes wide with wonder and fear. We see innocence colliding with the unknown, and we realize that history is not always written by generals, kings, or presidents. Sometimes history is written by the voices of children, children who looked up at the sky, saw something beyond their world, and never forgot it. Every great story has a turning point, a moment when ordinary life collides with the extraordinary. For the children of Ariel School in Ruwa, Zimbabwe, that turning point came suddenly, like a lightning strike on a clear day. 1 second, it was just another morning of laughter and games. The next, it was a moment frozen in time, the sighting that would make history. The children were outside, scattered across the schoolyard, their shouts echoing through the warm air. Some were playing tag, others chasing a ball, and a few just sitting in small groups talking. The teachers, as we know, were all in a staff meeting inside the main building. This left the children with a sense of freedom, the kind of freedom that comes when adults aren't hovering nearby. The African sun beat down, the smell of dust hung in the air, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary until someone looked up. At first, it was just a flicker in the sky. A few children noticed something unusual, a glint of light that seemed too steady, too smooth to be a bird. One boy pointed, shading his eyes with his hand. "What's that?" he asked, his voice more curious than afraid. A couple of his friends looked up, expecting to see an airplane. After all, planes sometimes flew over Ruwa, heading toward Harare. But this was no airplane. The object in the sky moved with an eerie silence. It didn't roar with engines. It didn't leave trails of smoke. It glided like it belonged to another set of rules, a different kind of sky. The more children looked, the quieter the playground became. Laughter and shouts faded into whispers, then into silence. Eyes turned upward, mouths hung open, fingers pointed. Soon, dozens of children were staring at the same thing, a shiny, disc-like object moving across the horizon. It reflected sunlight, but not like metal from a plane. It shimmered almost unnaturally, like it carried its own glow. Then, in a movement that would forever be burned into their memories, the object dipped lower. It descended, slowly but deliberately, toward the edge of the playground. The place where the open yard ended and the thick bush began suddenly became the center of the children's universe. The object hovered for a moment, then seemed to settle, as if landing or coming very close to the ground. Dust stirred at the edges of the bush, though there was no wind. A few brave children took small steps forward, curiosity pushing them closer. Others froze in place, rooted by fear. And then, the impossible happened. From this glowing disk, or just near it, figures appeared. They were not tall like adults. They were small, thin, almost fragile-looking. Their skin was described as pale, some said grayish, others said more black than white. But the feature every child remembered most were the eyes, huge, almond-shaped, black eyes that seemed too big for their faces. Those eyes locked onto the children, and in that moment, the playground was no longer just a playground. It was the stage for a silent, chilling encounter. One girl later said, "When I looked into their eyes, I felt something inside me." Another boy described how the beings moved, not like humans, but with a strange smoothness, as though they glided rather than walked. Their heads were large, their bodies thin, and their movements almost dreamlike. To children who had only known their parents, teachers, and friends, these figures were nothing they could compare to. They didn't look like people. They didn't look like animals. They looked like something out of another world. Some of the children reacted instantly with fear. Screams tore through the silence, and several of the youngest bolted back toward the school building, desperate to find safety. Their feet kicked up clouds of red dust as they ran. A few tripped, scrambled up, and kept going, their hearts pounding with terror. For them, this was not curiosity. It was a nightmare, a monster stepping out of the unknown. But others, especially the older kids, stood their ground. They stared, wide-eyed, trying to make sense of what they saw. Was it real? Was it a trick? Their minds raced with questions, but the longer they looked, the less it felt like a trick. The beings seemed aware of them. They turned their heads, raised their arms slightly, and looked directly at the children. And then something even stranger happened. Several of the children later reported that the beings spoke to them, but not with words. There was no sound, no language they could hear with their ears. Instead, there were thoughts, feelings, images, a kind of telepathic communication. The messages weren't long or complex, but they carried a weight that shook the children deeply. Many of them said the beings warned about the future of Earth, about technology, the environment, and the need to care for nature. For children living in the countryside, surrounded by farms and open land, this message hit close to home. They may not have fully understood it, but they felt its seriousness. Imagine being 10 years old and suddenly having a figure from the sky send a message straight into your mind. No words, no explanation, just a flood of meaning that you can't put into proper sentences. It would be overwhelming. And that's exactly what happened to these children. Not every child received the same message. Some only saw the beings and felt fear. Some described strange feelings they couldn't explain. Others swore they understood a warning about Earth. But all of them knew they had seen something extraordinary. The moment stretched on, though no one could say exactly how long it lasted. To the children, it felt like both an eternity and a flash. Time seemed to bend, slow down, and lose its meaning. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the moment began to end. The beings returned toward the craft. The shimmering disk rose silently into the sky. Higher and higher it went, until it vanished from sight, leaving nothing but a stunned silence across the playground. And then, the world rushed back in. The cries of frightened children, the whispers of those still staring at the sky, the pounding of feet as some ran to tell the teachers. The moment of the sighting was over, but its impact was permanent. Each child carried away a piece of that experience: fear, wonder, confusion, and awe. It is in this moment, more than any other, that the Ariel School Encounter became legendary. Not because of blurry photographs or shaky video footage, but because of the pure testimony of 60 children. Children who had no reason to lie. Children who could barely explain what had happened to them. Children who, in the innocence of their youth, had stumbled into one of the most mysterious events in modern history. For the rest of their lives, those kids would look back on that morning in 1994 as the moment in everything changed. The moment when the line between ordinary and extraordinary vanished. The moment when the sky stopped and something unknown came down to meet them. Every story has a climax, a peak moment when tension rises to its highest point. For the children of Ariel School, that moment came when the strange shining object in the sky stopped gliding and began to descend. Until then, the kids could still imagine it was just a trick of the light, a faraway plane, or something ordinary. But when the object dropped lower and lower, heading toward the ground near the edge of the schoolyard, they knew with absolute certainty this was not ordinary. This was something beyond their world. The bushland surrounding the school had always been a place of mystery for the kids. They were warned not to go too deep into it. Snakes, wild animals, and hidden dangers could be waiting. The bushes formed a kind of invisible boundary, a line between the safe world of the playground and the unknown wilderness beyond. And it was precisely there, right at that border, that the object came down. At first, the children thought it might just pass overhead, but no, it slowed, tilted slightly, and lowered itself with precision, almost as if it was choosing the spot deliberately. Several of the kids gasped, others clutched each other's arms. One boy whispered, "It's landing." And indeed, that is what it looked like, a shining disc-shaped craft, settling quietly near the ground. There was no roar of engines, no blast of wind, no smoke. Airplanes, helicopters, even cars, they all make noise. They all leave behind dust or fumes. But this craft seemed to glide into place with an unnatural silence. That silence made the moment even more terrifying. To the children, it was like watching a ghost descend, something real, yet otherworldly, and impossible to explain. The craft itself was described in different ways by different kids, but the similarities stood out. Many said it was round, like a disc or saucer. Some said it shimmered, reflecting light in a way no normal metal could. A few described it as glowing faintly, almost as though it was alive with energy. To young eyes, it seemed both mechanical and magical at the same time. No one saw wheels, wings, or engines. It didn't look like anything that could be built by human hands, at least not in their world. As it neared the ground, the children felt an eerie shift in the air. Some said the atmosphere grew heavy, as though the world itself was holding its breath. A few claimed they heard a strange buzzing in their ears, like static on a radio. Others reported nothing but silence, a silence so deep it made their skin crawl. Whatever it was, it made them feel that they were no longer alone. The craft hovered for a moment just above the bushes, then seemed to settle. Dust and leaves stirred faintly beneath it, though there was no wind. The red soil at the edge of the playground looked almost like it glowed from the reflection of the craft's surface. The children stood frozen, their eyes locked on the scene. Some wanted to run, but their legs wouldn't move. Others edged closer, curiosity stronger than fear. And then, the impossible became even more impossible. Something moved near the craft. One child cried out, pointing. Another grabbed a friend's arm. Slowly, cautiously, figures appeared beside the object. They were small, much smaller than an adult, but unmistakably humanoid. Their bodies were thin, their heads large, their arms long. Their movements were strange, almost gliding, as though gravity did not affect them the way it affects us. The children's hearts pounded. They had expected maybe a machine, maybe a trick, but not living beings. The beings stepped closer to the edge of the bushes, visible now in the full light of day. The children could see their pale or gray skin, their thin limbs, and above all, their enormous dark eyes. Eyes that seemed to swallow the world, eyes that held a depth and intensity no human eyes could. It was as though those eyes could see not just the outside, but the inside, peering straight into thoughts and feelings. Some of the children screamed then. They turned and bolted back toward the main school building, their shouts echoing across the yard. But many remained, too stunned to move. One boy later said, "I couldn't stop looking. It was like they wanted me to look." Another girl said, "I felt as if they were talking to me, but not with words." This was the moment of landing, the moment when a glowing, otherworldly craft settled at the edge of an African schoolyard, and beings unlike anything on Earth stepped out to face 60 innocent children. It was no longer just a sighting in the sky. It was an encounter, personal and close. The children's descriptions of this moment varied in detail, but the core remained the same. The craft was there, solid and real, sitting or hovering close to the ground. The beings were there, moving around it, looking directly at them. The combination of the silent machine and the living figures made the scene unforgettable. It was like something from a dream, yet every child insisted it was real. To this day, those who were there remember the strange feeling that swept over them during the landing. It was not just fear. It was not just curiosity. It was a mix of emotions so powerful that even decades later, as adults, they struggle to describe it. Some say they felt awe, as though they were in the presence of something greater. Others say they felt dread, a deep, instinctive warning that this was dangerous. A few even felt comfort, a sense that the beings meant no harm. But all agreed, this was a moment unlike any other in their lives. The landing at Ariel School is one of the reasons why this case is considered so strong in UFO history. Many sightings are distant lights, unclear photographs, or fleeting shadows. But here, in broad daylight, dozens of children saw a craft land close enough to touch. They saw figures emerge and move. They felt the weight of the moment in their minds and hearts. This was not imagination. This was an experience that stamped itself onto their memories forever. As the craft rested at the edge of the bush and the beings made themselves known, the children realized their ordinary world had just been invaded by the extraordinary. For the rest of their lives, they would look back on this morning as the moment when reality changed, the moment when the sky came down to meet them. For the children of Ariel School, the sight of the shining disk coming down from the sky was already enough to leave them speechless. But what happened next is what truly burned itself into their memories. It was not just about a strange object, it was about the figures that stepped out from it. Beings that looked nothing like their parents, their teachers, or anyone they had ever known. Beings that would later be drawn in dozens of sketches, remembered in interviews decades later, and debated by researchers and skeptics around the world. When the objects settled near the edge of the bush, the children's eyes widened, their breath caught in their throats. The silence was heavy, almost unnatural, as if the world itself was waiting. And then, movement. Small figures appeared, slipping into view beside the craft. At first, some of the children thought their eyes were playing tricks. Maybe it was shadows. Maybe it was people from far away. But as the beings stepped closer, every child realized this was no illusion. They were described as small, thin, and fragile-looking. Most children estimated their height at around 1 meter, maybe 3 to 4 feet tall. Their arms were long, hanging lower than a human's would. Their heads were large and round, almost too big for their small bodies. And then there were the eyes, huge, dark, almond-shaped eyes that seemed to dominate their faces. No whites, no pupils, just endless black that seemed to swallow light itself. The children would later try to put these features into words, but words always fell short. Some simply said they had big eyes. Others said they looked like dolls, or like people, but not people. But every description circled back to those same features: small bodies, large heads, long arms, and those unforgettable eyes. The beings did not move like humans. Their steps were smooth, almost gliding, as though gravity did not weigh them down in the same way. Some of the kids said the beings seemed to float more than walk, their bodies shifting with an eerie grace. Their movements were slow, deliberate, and strangely quiet. It was as if they were not in a hurry, almost as if they knew the children would not run away, no matter how scared they were. A group of braver children stood frozen at the edge of the playground, staring. Their mouths were dry, their hearts pounding in their chests. Some whispered to each other, "Do you see them?" "Yes, I see them too." The confirmation that they were not alone in this vision made the fear both more real and strangely less lonely. They were sharing something incredible. Not all the children reacted with courage. Several of the younger ones screamed and ran. One girl later admitted she shut her eyes and prayed, hoping when she opened them the figures would be gone. Another boy ran toward the main building shouting for the teachers, though the teachers were still locked in their meeting, unaware of the drama unfolding outside. But those who stayed and watched saw more than just shapes. They described the beings as wearing tight-fitting suits, dark or shiny in color. Some thought they saw boots, others thought the beings were barefoot. Details blurred in the shock of the moment, but the impression was always the same. These were not humans dressed up. They were something else, something entirely different. And then came the strangest part, the feeling of communication without words. Several children later described how, as they locked eyes with the beings, they felt thoughts pressing into their minds. Not spoken language, not sounds, but feelings, impressions, images. One girl said she saw pictures in her head of the earth being destroyed by human technology, of forests being cut down, of the world growing sick. Another boy said he felt a deep sadness, as though the beings were warning him of something terrible. A few others described nothing more than a powerful sense of being watched. Watched not just on the outside, but on the inside, as though their thoughts were laid bare. Imagine being 9 or 10 years old, and suddenly you feel someone else inside your mind. You don't know the words for it, you can't explain it to your friends, but you know it happened. This was the reality for those children. Their innocence made the experience all the more intense. They didn't question the mechanics of telepathy. They didn't ask how it worked. They simply accepted that these beings were communicating directly into their heads. Some of the children began to cry, overwhelmed by fear and confusion. Others could not move, locked in place by those dark, endless eyes. A few even felt calm, strangely reassured, as though the beings did not mean harm. This wide range of emotional reactions is one of the things that makes their testimony so believable. It was not a single rehearsed response. It was the raw, messy, human reactions of dozens of kids facing the unknown. The beings themselves did not stay long. They moved near the craft, watching the children with what seemed like curiosity. Some of the kids felt as though the beings were studying them, just as they were studying the beings. A strange exchange of observation was taking place. Children staring at visitors from the sky, and visitors staring back at the children of Earth. The longer the figures stood there, the more the children felt torn between terror and fascination. Part of them wanted to run to safety, to escape. Part of them wanted to step closer, to see more, to understand what they were looking at. This tension stretched every second into an eternity. When the beings finally turned back toward the craft, many of the children felt both relief and disappointment. Relief that the frightening eyes were no longer fixed on them. Disappointment that the mystery was leaving before they could make sense of it. Slowly, the figures moved back into the shimmering disk. The craft itself began to rise, smooth and silent, lifting above the bushes, above the trees, and then vanishing into the wide blue sky. But though the beings were gone, the memory of their presence would never leave the children. For many of them, those eyes would return in their dreams for years. The sense of silent communication would replay in their minds whenever they thought about the future. The moment was over, but its impact was eternal. In the history of UFO encounters, the appearance of the beings at Ariel School stands out as one of the most detailed and credible accounts. Not only because dozens of children described the same features, but because their innocence made deception unlikely. They didn't speak in the language of adults inventing stories. They spoke in the language of children, simple, direct, and honest. They had big heads. They had big eyes. They were small. They talked in my mind. These were the words of young witnesses, unpolished but powerful. For the rest of their lives, those children would remember the moment the beings appeared. Some would grow up to become professionals, parents, and adults living far from Ruwa. Yet in every interview, in every memory, their voices carried the same truth. I saw them. I know what I saw. I will never forget. The strange beings of Ariel School were not just figures in the bush. They were the heart of the encounter, the part of the story that transformed it from a UFO sighting into a close contact experience. They turned a mysterious object into a moment of human history, shared by children who had no reason to lie and no way to forget. And so, September 16, 1994, will forever be remembered not just as the day a craft landed near Ariel School, but as the day strange beings appeared in the eyes of innocent children, leaving behind a mystery the world still cannot explain. When people hear stories about UFOs, they often think of flashing lights in the sky or strange machines hovering in the distance. But what happened at Ariel School was different. It was not just about what the children saw. It was also about what they felt and what they received inside their minds. The moment the strange beings appeared, many of the children reported something that still leaves researchers stunned: the feeling of telepathic communication. It began with the eyes, those enormous black almond-shaped eyes that seemed too large for the small heads and thin bodies of the beings. The eyes were not just looking, they were reaching. The children said it felt like the eyes were pulling them in, holding them, locking them in place. For some it was terrifying, as if they were being controlled. For others, it was mesmerizing, like being drawn into a deep ocean. But for many, the eyes were more than just eyes. They were a channel, a doorway into the mind. One girl, only about 12 years old, later described it simply: I felt as if they were talking to me, but not with words. She said that when she looked into their eyes, pictures appeared in her head. Pictures of trees, forests, rivers. Then, just as quickly, pictures of machines, smoke, and destruction. She felt a message without sound. Humans were harming the earth, and it could not continue. Another boy explained it differently. He didn't see clear pictures, but he felt something, a kind of heavy sadness, as though the beings were carrying a warning. He said, "I felt they were telling us something important, like they were worried, but I don't know how I understood, I just knew." For children so young, these descriptions are remarkable. They were not scientists, not philosophers, not activists. They were just kids playing outside on a sunny morning. And yet, in those few minutes, they felt as though they were receiving messages about the fate of the entire planet. The messages were not the same for everyone. Some children reported no communication at all, just fear and shock. Others said they received impressions too powerful to ignore. The variety of responses makes sense. Telepathy, if it exists, might not affect everyone equally. Some minds might be more open, more receptive. Some children may have been too scared to notice. But the common thread is clear. Many of them believed they were being warned. What exactly were they being warned about? The most common theme was technology and the environment. Several children said the beings seemed to show them visions of Earth being destroyed by human greed and machines. They spoke later of forests burning, animals dying, and the world growing empty. Others described feelings about pollution, about humans losing touch with nature. These were not ideas the children usually thought about in their daily lives. They were school kids, worried about homework and playtime, not the survival of the planet. Yet, in that moment, they carried messages far beyond their years. One of the older students said something striking in an interview years later. "I knew they wanted us to take care of the earth. I felt it so strongly that I cried. It was not words, it was just there in my head. They made me feel it." Her testimony has been repeated in documentaries and articles because of its honesty and power. But there was also another layer to the communication: fear of human technology itself. A few of the children said they felt the beings were warning not just about pollution or trees being cut down, but about the dangers of machines and inventions. One child explained, "I saw something like people making too many things, like too much technology, and it was bad." Another said, "They told us we were going the wrong way with our inventions." For children in 1994, rural Zimbabwe, these were not everyday thoughts. Computers were rare. Cell phones were not common. Their world was still deeply connected to the land. And yet, they carried away warnings about technology that seemed more fitting for adults living in the modern, digital future. Skeptics have asked, did the children imagine it? Did they copy each other's stories? But interviews done immediately after the encounter show something different. The children were separated and asked individually what they saw and felt. Time and again, they repeated the same themes: the eyes, the silent messages, the warnings. Their words may have been simple, but their consistency was powerful. What makes the Ariel School encounter so unique in UFO history is not just that 60 children saw strange beings in daylight, it is that many of them felt spoken to without speech. This detail separates it from many other sightings. It was not just a visual experience, it was mental, emotional, almost spiritual. To imagine the moment, think of standing outside in the sun, suddenly facing figures that should not exist. You cannot move, you cannot speak. And then, without opening their mouths, they press thoughts into your brain. Thoughts you did not ask for. Thoughts too big for your age. Thoughts that feel true even if you don't understand them. That is what the children went through. The aftermath of these messages was long-lasting. Some of the children said the encounter changed how they saw the world. A few grew up to become environmentalists, teachers, or people deeply connected to protecting nature. They said the warnings stayed with them for life. Others tried to push the memories away, but even then, they admitted they could never forget the eyes or the strange feelings they carried. The telepathic communication of Ariel School has been studied by psychologists, journalists, and UFO researchers alike. Some suggest it could have been a form of mass hysteria, with children influencing each other. But mass hysteria does not explain the vivid individual experiences of silent communication that were described separately. Others argue it was imagination. Yet, imagination usually differs wildly from child to child. Here, the testimonies were remarkably similar. Whether one believes in extraterrestrials or not, the fact remains. Dozens of children sincerely reported that they were silently spoken to by beings not of this world. Their testimonies have remained consistent for decades. Even as adults, when interviewed years later, their stories did not change. If it were imagination, surely time would fade the details. But instead, their memories remained sharp, as though the telepathic messages had carved themselves into their minds permanently. The Ariel School encounter is remembered for many reasons: the daylight sighting, the number of witnesses, the strange beings. But it is the telepathic messages that make it stand out as something more than just a UFO story. It is a human story, a story of children receiving warnings about the future of their planet, messages they were too young to invent, yet too real to ignore. And so, as the beings turned back toward their craft and the glowing disk began to rise into the sky, the children were left not only with memories of what they saw, but with invisible imprints of what they felt. Silent voices echoing in their heads, pictures of a world in danger, warnings they would carry into adulthood. The strange beings disappeared, but their messages remained. And that, perhaps, was the most powerful part of all. When the strange beings appeared near the craft, the playground of Ariel School transformed from a place of laughter into a stage of raw human emotion. It was no longer just a sunny African morning with the sounds of children playing. It became a battlefield of the mind, panic on one side, curiosity on the other. The children, 60 of them, were forced to choose how to react when confronted with the unimaginable, and their reactions would tell us more about human nature than we might expect. At first, panic spread like a wave. The youngest children, only 6 or 7 years old, were the first to scream. To them, the figures emerging from the shimmering object were monsters, creatures from nightmares made real. Their instincts took over. Tiny feet pounded against the red soil as they ran toward the school building, their cries piercing the still air. A group of little ones clung to each other, tears streaming down their faces as they begged for teachers who weren't there. The staff meeting inside the main block might as well have been on another planet. The children were on their own. Some older kids, around 10 or 11, also felt the icy grip of fear. Their eyes widened, their bodies trembled, and they froze in place. They wanted to run, but their legs would not obey. It was as if the dark eyes of the beings had rooted them to the spot. They stood like statues, hearts thumping so hard they could feel it in their throats. For them, fear was not about running away. It was about being paralyzed, trapped between the instinct to flee and the inability to move. But not every child was overcome with panic. For some, curiosity blazed stronger than fear. A handful of children took cautious steps forward, trying to get a closer look. Their fear was there, yes, but it was mixed with fascination. "What are they?" one boy whispered to himself, as if asking the question might some. "How bring an answer?" Another girl squinted, tilting her head, trying to capture every detail of the beings before they vanished. Their thin bodies, their smooth movements, their enormous eyes, these were details she would later sketch with astonishing clarity. The clash between panic and curiosity divided the playground. On one side, small groups of children huddled together, crying, screaming, or running. On the other, clusters of braver, or perhaps just more curious students stood still, whispering, pointing, or edging closer. It was like two different worlds unfolding in the same place, one filled with terror, the other with wonder. Imagine it, the dust rising from running feet, the sharp cries of frightened children, and just a few steps away, the heavy silence of others staring with wide-eyed fascination. It was chaos, but it was also history being written in real time. The panic was not irrational. These children were raised in a land where danger in the bush was real. Snakes could strike from nowhere. Wild animals could appear suddenly. The bush was always a place of mystery and caution. To see strange beings at the edge of that bush would naturally trigger primal fear. To the youngest kids, there was no difference between these beings and dangerous predators. The instinct to survive took over. But curiosity is also a natural instinct, especially in children. For some, the beings were not predators, they were puzzles. Living mysteries, and puzzles invite closer looks. That curiosity led them to lock eyes with the beings, to notice details others missed. One boy later described how he couldn't stop staring at the way the beings' heads tilted, almost like owls, as they looked back at the children. Another remembered the faint shine on their clothing, something like a suit, but not like anything made of cloth. And then there were those torn between the two instincts. Children who wanted to run, but also wanted to look. They edged back slowly, glancing over their shoulders, but their eyes stayed fixed on the beings. Some clutched their friends' arms, torn between pulling them toward safety and pushing them forward to see more. This tug-of-war between panic and curiosity left many children confused, breathless, and shaken long after the event ended. The balance of reactions was telling. Roughly half of the children later described feeling overwhelming fear, the kind that made their stomachs twist and their legs weak. The other half described curiosity mixed with unease, a desire to understand what they were seeing. Very few were neutral. No one shrugged it off as unimportant. Every child reacted deeply, either in panic or in fascination. One of the most striking things about these reactions is how genuine they were. When interviewed separately, the children told their stories with wide eyes and trembling voices. Some cried as they remembered. Others leaned forward, speaking with the intensity of someone trying to explain the impossible. Their body language revealed the truth of their experiences. Fear is hard to fake. Curiosity is hard to invent. And together, these raw emotions painted a picture of an event that went far beyond imagination. Panic did not end with the being's departure. For many children, the sense of dread lingered. That night, some were too scared to sleep. They saw the beings in their dreams, their enormous black eyes staring at them in the dark. They clung to their parents, unable to explain what they had seen, but sure it was real. Some even refused to go near the bush for weeks afterward. For them, the playground had been transformed. It was no longer just a place of play, it was the place where the unknown had touched their world. Curiosity, too, had lasting effects. The children who dared to stare longer, who studied the beings and tried to make sense of the encounter, carried away questions that would last a lifetime. Who were they? Why did they come? Why us? For some, these questions grew into lifelong interests in science, philosophy, or even activism. They felt chosen in a way, as if the beings had revealed something important to them. The warning messages, the feelings of telepathy, all of it was reinforced by their willingness to look, not run. In the grand story of the Ariel School Encounter, this chapter, the moment of panic and curiosity, reveals something profound about humanity itself. When confronted with the unknown, some of us run, driven by fear. Others step closer, driven by wonder. And perhaps both reactions are necessary. Fear keeps us safe. Curiosity pushes us forward. Together, they shape how we survive and how we grow. For the children of Rua, Zimbabwe, on that September day in 1994, both instincts played out side by side. Panic filled the air with shouts and cries. Curiosity filled the silence with wide eyes and whispers. And together, those reactions created the unforgettable story we still tell today. The story of 60 children who stood at the edge of the unknown, caught between the urge to flee and the desire to understand. The beings eventually returned to their craft. The disc rose silently, and the playground returned to stillness. But the emotions never faded. Panic and curiosity had etched themselves deep into the children's hearts. Years later, when they became adults, their memories remained vivid, not just of what they saw, but of how they felt. Fear that shook their bones, curiosity that burned in their minds. And that is why this story endures. When the shining disc lifted silently into the bright Zimbabwean sky and finally disappeared from sight, the playground at Ariel School did not return to normal. The beings were gone, the craft was gone, but the air still carried the weight of what had just happened. The aftermath was almost as powerful as the encounter itself. 60 children were left behind with their racing hearts, trembling bodies, and minds struggling to make sense of the extraordinary moment they had just witnessed. For a few seconds after the craft vanished, silence fell over the playground. It was the kind of silence that comes after a thunderclap, thick, heavy, almost unnatural. The children stood frozen, their eyes still fixed on the empty sky, as though hoping or fearing that the object would return. Then, Slowly, the silence broke. A scream here, a cry there. Then the playground erupted in noise, voices shouting, children talking over each other, questions tumbling out in a storm of confusion. Some of the youngest children were crying uncontrollably, their faces wet with tears. They huddled together, holding hands, seeking comfort from their classmates. For them, the beings were monsters, terrifying creatures that had stepped out of their nightmares. Their fear was raw, unfiltered, and heartbreaking. They wanted their parents, their teachers, anyone who could make sense of what had just happened. Other children, older and slightly braver, were buzzing with energy. Their eyes sparkled, their voices shook with excitement, and their hands moved wildly as they tried to describe what they saw. "Did you see their eyes?" one boy shouted. "They were so big," another added. "They were talking to me in my head," a girl exclaimed, her voice trembling with both fear and wonder. These children were not running or crying, they were trying to understand. The playground became a chaotic theater of emotions. Panic, relief, awe, curiosity, all mixing together like colors splashed onto the same canvas. Some kids wanted to forget it ever happened, others couldn't stop talking about it. Some whispered, worried that the beings might come back. Others pointed to the bush, arguing about exactly where the craft had landed. A few even dared to walk closer to the edge of the bushes, curious to see if anything was left behind. Their small footprints pressed into the dusty soil as they edged closer, hearts pounding, eyes scanning for signs. The teachers were still in their meeting, unaware of the storm outside. This gave the children a rare freedom. They were alone, without adult explanations or guidance, left to process everything on their own. That made the aftermath even more intense. Without authority figures to dismiss their fears or calm their curiosity, the children turned to each other. They compared stories, argued, shouted, comforted, and questioned. The playground became not just a space of play, but a courtroom of testimony, with each child offering their version of the truth. Some argued about details. "There were two beings," one insisted. "No, I saw only one," another shouted. "They had shiny suits," a girl said. "No, they were naked," someone else countered. But even in their disagreements, there was a shared foundation. Something happened. Something they all saw, all felt, even if the details blurred under the weight of shock. The emotional aftershocks spread across the playground in waves. A group of children sat under a tree, holding each other, too shaken to talk. Another group stood near the edge of the bush, pointing and gesturing wildly, reliving the moment over and over again. A few boys tried to act brave, laughing nervously, but their pale faces betrayed their fear. No one could escape the intensity of the experience. One of the most striking things about this aftermath was how the children reacted physically. Some were shaking so hard they could barely stand. Others clutched their stomachs, sick with fear. A few felt dizzy, disoriented, as though the world itself had shifted beneath their feet. It was as if the encounter had not only touched their minds, but also their bodies. Their adrenaline was surging, their senses on fire, their small hearts racing at double speed. The older children tried to take control, gathering the younger ones, calming them down. They whispered words of comfort. "It's okay. They're gone now." But even as they said it, their own voices shook. They were trying to be brave, but deep inside, they were just as shaken. The younger children clung to them, nodding, wiping their tears, trying to believe in the shaky reassurances. Some of the children did something remarkable. They began to draw. Using sticks, they sketched in the dirt what they had seen. Round shapes for the craft, tall heads with big eyes for the beings. The drawings were crude but powerful. They were their way of holding on to the memory, of making it real by putting it into symbols. Those sketches in the playground dust became the first records of the Ariel School Encounter. As the minutes passed, the playground did not calm down. It became louder. Voices rose as more children told their stories. Some repeated the same sentences over and over, as if trying to convince themselves it had really happened. Others sat quietly, staring into the distance, too shocked to speak. Each child processed the aftermath differently, but all were changed. When the teachers finally emerged from their meeting, they were met with chaos. Children ran up to them, shouting, crying, talking so fast the words blurred together. The teachers tried to calm them, but the flood of voices was overwhelming. They came from the sky. There was a ship. They had big eyes. The teachers looked confused, skeptical, even concerned. At first they thought it might be a game, a story the children had invented. But the sheer number of kids telling the same story, with the same trembling urgency, made it impossible to ignore. That moment, when the teachers stepped into the whirlwind of the aftermath, was the bridge between the children's world and the adult world. It was the start of the investigation, the interviews, the sketches, and the lasting legacy of the Ariel School Encounter. But before all of that came, there was this raw, unfiltered aftermath on the playground. The soil still bore the footprints of 60 children running, freezing, or edging closer. The air still carried the echoes of their screams and whispers. The dust sketches faded quickly, but the memories remained burned into their minds. The playground, once a place of games and laughter, had become sacred ground, the stage of an event that none of them would ever forget. For the children, the aftermath was not just about fear or excitement. It was about realization that they had seen something extraordinary, something that would forever separate September 16, 1994, from every other school day. It was the day the playground became a place of history, the day their innocence collided with the unknown. The bell rang that morning at Ariel School, echoing across the dusty courtyard. Normally, the ringing meant order. Children lined up, chatter faded, and the calm authority of teachers took over. But on September 16, 1994, order refused to return. When the teachers stepped out of their meeting, they were not greeted by neat lines of students. Instead, they walked into a storm of trembling voices, wide eyes, and frantic gestures. Dozens of children rushed at them from every direction. Tiny hands tugged at skirts, shirts, and sleeves. High-pitched voices overlapped in a chaotic symphony. "Miss, we saw something." There were people, small people. They came from a ship. They had big eyes. At first, the teachers frowned, exchanging puzzled glances. In rural Zimbabwe, children often told wild stories during playtime. But this was different. The noise was too overwhelming, the urgency too raw. These were not playful exaggerations. These were desperate attempts to make adults believe. One teacher raised her hands, trying to calm them. "Quiet, one at a time." But the demand was hopeless. The stories poured out like floodwater breaking a dam. Each child shouted over the other, desperate to be heard. Fear, wonder, and shock filled their little faces. The headmistress, Mrs. Mackey, soon arrived. She was strict but fair, the kind of woman who commanded respect without raising her voice. She looked at the chaos before her, eyebrows furrowing. Children clung to her, crying, shouting, trembling. It was unlike anything she had seen in her years at the school. Finally, she led them to the assembly area, determined to restore calm. "Now," she said firmly, "you will tell me what happened, but you must tell it slowly and one at a time." And so the flood became a stream. One boy, his voice shaking, said, "There was a big round thing. It landed there." He pointed toward the bush at the stuntas, his edge of the playground. A girl added quickly, "2 men came out. They were not like us. They had big heads, very big eyes." Another whispered, "They looked at me. I could hear them in my mind." Mrs. Mackey's face tightened. She did not laugh, but she did not believe, not yet. She thought perhaps the children had imagined it, or that mass hysteria had spread among them. Still, she could not ignore the sheer number of students repeating the same strange details. The other teachers shared nervous looks. Some shook their heads. Some pressed the children with skeptical questions. "Are you sure? Maybe it was a helicopter? Maybe it was a prank?" But the answers remained consistent. The children insisted it was none of those things. The aftermath on the playground had now spilled into the world of the adults. The teachers had to decide what to do. They knew this would not end quietly. When the school day ended, the story traveled further. The children went home still buzzing, still shaken. As soon as they saw their parents, the words tumbled out again. "Mama, we saw something." "Baba, there was a spaceship. There were people, but not people like us." Some parents dismissed it immediately. "Nonsense," they said. "You're making up stories." In many African households, especially in rural communities, children were expected to be respectful and not exaggerate. Talk of little men from the sky sounded like fantasy, and fantasy was not tolerated in homes where survival was practical and serious. But not every parent could ignore the sheer intensity in their child's eyes. These were not casual lies or playful imaginations. Their children's hands shook, their voices wavered. Some had tears still clinging to their eyelashes. Mothers and fathers exchanged worried looks. What if? They wondered silently. At dinner tables that night, the event became the center of conversation. Aunts quizzed their children again and again, looking for cracks in the story. Where exactly? How big? What did they look like? Yet the answers stayed the same. Consistency among 60 children, spread across different grades and backgrounds, was impossible to ignore. The next morning, some parents visited the school. They wanted answers. What had happened on the playground? Why were their children so disturbed? The teachers could only shrug. They explained that they, too, had not seen the event. Only the children had been outside. But the pressure was building. A story of this magnitude could not stay within the school walls. It began to leak into the community. Local shopkeepers heard whispers. Churchgoers exchanged gossip. Soon, journalists caught wind of it. Word reached researchers, including the well-known Harvard psychiatrist Dr. John Mack, who would later travel thousands of miles to hear the children's testimonies firsthand. But before any outsiders arrived, the weight of the story rested on the shoulders of teachers and parents, and their reactions shaped what came next. Some teachers tried to protect the children. They told skeptical parents, "I think something frightened them. I don't know what it was, but they believe it." These teachers admitted their own doubts, but refused to dismiss the children outright. They knew how serious and genuine the fear had been. Other teachers were harsher. They scolded the children, telling them to stop spreading nonsense. They worried that the school's reputation might be damaged. "No one will take us seriously if this gets out," one teacher warned. Fear of ridicule was as strong for the adults as fear of the beings had been for the children. Parents, too, were divided. Some whispered at night that perhaps spirits had visited. In many African traditions, the spirit world and the physical world were not so separate. Strange beings appearing in the bush could be interpreted as ancestors, demons, or messengers. But these beings, with their large black eyes and silent stares, did not fit neatly into traditional beliefs. That made them even more unsettling. For other parents, the answer was simpler. The children had imagined it: peer pressure, excitement, or a shared dream. They wanted to believe their children were safe, that nothing out of the ordinary had invaded their school. Believing in UFOs was too frightening. Dismissing them was easier. Yet, the story refused to fade. Each child repeated their account with unwavering certainty. The details might differ slightly. Two beings, one being, shiny clothes, black suits, but the core never changed. Something landed. Beings emerged. They looked into our minds. This unshakable consistency began to erode adult skepticism. Teachers and parents found themselves asking the same questions the children had asked. Who were they? Why here? Why our children? The teachers decided to document what had happened. They asked the children to draw what they had seen. The results were chilling. Page after page showed discs in the sky, strange figures with huge heads and enormous dark eyes. The drawings came from different children, different ages, but they all carried the same haunting features. When the stack of drawings reached the hands of parents, silence fell across living rooms. It was one thing to hear wild words from excited children. It was another to see their memories etched in pencil and crayon. The images were too similar, too vivid, too real. The moment the teachers and parents were informed, the Ariel School Encounter transformed. It was no longer just a playground story whispered among classmates. It became a community mystery, an event too large to contain. The adults might not have believed fully, but they could not ignore it. The children had seen something, and whatever it was, it had left a permanent mark on Tetsuisi, school, the families, and soon the entire world. At first, the Ariel School Encounter was only a story whispered among the children, their teachers, and their parents. But strange events have a way of growing larger, like ripples spreading across a pond. Soon, the whispers carried beyond the schoolyard walls, drifting into the town of Rua, into the ears of journalists, and eventually into the headlines of newspapers and television screens. What began as a frightening morning recess would soon become an international sensation. The first step toward media coverage happened quietly. Parents who had been skeptical began sharing the story with friends and neighbors. At the local markets, as people traded vegetables and maize, whispers of flying saucers and strange beings crept into conversation. Zimbabwe, like many African nations at the time, was a land rich in tradition and oral storytelling. Stories moved quickly, sometimes faster than facts. But this story was different. It wasn't just folklore, it wasn't just gossip. It was backed by 60 terrified yet consistent voices. The children of Ariel School. Soon, word reached local journalists. At first, some dismissed it. Children making up stories, they thought. But curiosity won. One reporter decided to visit the school. What he found stunned him. Dozens of children, all telling the same incredible story, their voices trembling, their drawings eerily similar. He realized this was not just a schoolyard fantasy. Something had happened, something newsworthy. The first articles appeared in local newspapers. The headlines were cautious but eye-catching. Strange sightings at rural school. Children report mysterious beings. Readers were divided. Some laughed, dismissing it as nonsense. Others leaned forward whispering, "What if it's true?" In a country where traditional beliefs often blended with modern life, the story struck a powerful chord. It was both terrifying and fascinating, a modern mystery unfolding in real time. Television reporters soon followed. A small camera crew arrived at Ariel School, their bulky equipment attracting even more attention. The children, still shaken but eager to share, stood before the cameras. Their voices cracked with emotion as they described what they had seen. Some looked straight into the lens, their eyes wide with sincerity. Others could not hold back tears. Viewers at home, watching on flickering screens, felt the weight of those emotions. These were not rehearsed actors. These were ordinary children telling an extraordinary story. One clip showed a young girl clutching her arms, as if trying to hug herself for comfort. "They looked at me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They told me things. In my head." The camera zoomed in, capturing every quiver in her lip, every flicker of fear in her eyes. That single clip spread like wildfire. It was replayed again and again, not just in Zimbabwe, but eventually in newsrooms across the globe. The international press began to take notice. By the mid-1990s, stories of UFOs were not new, but they were often ridiculed or dismissed. What made the Ariel School encounter different was the sheer number of witnesses, 60 children, all telling strikingly similar stories. It was hard to ignore. Soon, newspapers in South Africa picked up the story. Radio stations invited callers to discuss it. Some callers mocked it. Others claimed they had seen strange lights in the sky themselves. The event was no longer just a local curiosity. It was becoming a regional mystery. By the time the BBC sent a crew to Zimbabwe, the Ariel School encounter had grown into one of the most talked about stories in southern Africa. The BBC interviews added credibility. The children spoke calmly and consistently, repeating the same details they had given their teachers and parents. The footage shocked viewers worldwide. People who had dismissed UFOs as fantasy now found themselves unsettled. After all, these weren't random strangers. They were children, innocent and honest, with nothing to gain by lying. The media coverage also sparked debates in living rooms, classrooms, and government offices. Some people asked, was this mass hysteria, a shared illusion, or real contact? Scientists debated on radio shows. Psychologists wrote opinion pieces in newspapers. Priests gave sermons warning of deception, while others spoke of signs and messages. The story refused to fade. It demanded attention. As the media frenzy grew, something remarkable happened. The children became unlikely celebrities. Reporters followed them, microphones thrust toward their small faces, cameras clicking with every nervous expression. For many of the kids, the attention was overwhelming. They were just ordinary school children who had wanted to play during recess. Now, they were the center of an international mystery. Some enjoyed the attention, proudly retelling their story. Others shrank from it, too shy to speak under the glare of lights. But through it all, their testimonies remained steady. We saw them. They looked at us. They were not human. No matter how many times they were asked, no matter how many skeptical adults tried to twist their words, the core of their story did not change. That consistency became one of the strongest pieces of evidence in the entire case. Media coverage also brought pressure. Some adults accused the children of lying for attention. Others claimed the school had staged it. Parents worried about ridicule. Teachers worried about the school's reputation. The headmistress herself felt torn. Protect the children from the harsh spotlight, or let their voices be heard. In the end, the story was too big to hide. The floodgates truly opened when Harvard RD psychiatrist Dr. John Mack arrived in Zimbabwe. By then, international media had already paved the way, but Mack's involvement added academic weight. News outlets eagerly reported, Harvard professor investigates UFO sighting in Africa. The story leapt from regional news into global headlines. CNN, The Guardian, Time magazine, all began to cover it. What had started as a frightened recess in Rua was now a global phenomenon. The coverage painted Ariel School as a strange, almost mythical place. Journalists described the red soil, the tall grass of the bush, the laughter of children interrupted by the unimaginable. They wrote about the drawings, page after page of discs and strange beings. They aired interviews where children's voices shook with sincerity. They captured the mixture of fear and fascination that lingered in the air. For weeks, the Ariel School Encounter dominated conversations. It was discussed in offices in London, cafes in New York, and living rooms in Johannesburg. The children of Zimbabwe had forced the world to look at the UFO phenomenon, not as science fiction, but as a question demanding serious thought. The power of the media coverage lay not just in spreading the story, but in amplifying the children's voices. Without cameras and newspapers, the Ariel School Encounter might have faded into rumor, remembered only by a small community in Zimbabwe. Instead, it became one of the most famous UFO encounters in history, preserved forever in news archives and television footage. Yet with attention came consequences. The children, once anonymous, were now burdened with the weight of global curiosity. Some thrived under the spotlight. Others wished it would all go away. But whether they liked it or not, the story had escaped their playground. It now belonged to the world. The Ariel School story had already reached far beyond the red soil of Rua. Newspapers wrote about it. Radio hosts debated it. Television cameras had captured the frightened eyes of children, describing beings with enormous heads and black eyes. But for the story to move from sensational headlines to serious study, investigators had to arrive. And when they did, the playground became more than just a place of childhood memories. It became a living case file. The first wave of investigators were local reporters and community leaders. They arrived with notebooks, tape recorders, and skeptical minds. At the start, many believed they would quickly uncover a hoax or a misunderstanding. But within minutes of speaking to the children, that confidence wavered. 60 children from different classes and backgrounds all told the same core story with remarkable consistency. They drew the same shapes, described the same dark eyes, and trembled with the same fear. Skepticism began to shift into curiosity. Teachers guided the investigators across the playground, pointing toward the edge of the bush. "That's where they say it happened," one teacher explained. Investigators knelt down, scanning the dry grass for evidence, burnt patches, strange impressions, anything physical. But the bush was silent, ordinary, as if it had swallowed its secrets overnight. The lack of physical evidence frustrated the skeptics, but did not silence the children's voices. As the days passed, the story reached academic ears. Among those intrigued was Dr. John Mack, a Harvard psychiatrist known for his groundbreaking work with people who claim to have had contact with extraterrestrial beings. Mack had spent years studying experiencers, individuals who reported abduction or contact experiences, and while many dismissed his work as fringe, he approached it with the seriousness of a scientist. When he heard about it, at the Ariel School Encounter, he knew he had to see it for himself. His arrival in Zimbabwe was met with curiosity and suspicion. Some parents worried about exposing their children to more attention. Others hoped an expert could finally explain what had happened. Mack walked into Ariel School with a calm, gentle presence. He didn't come with cameras or bright lights. He came with notebooks, questions, and the patience to listen. The first thing Mac noticed was the children's body language. They did not act like liars or pranksters. They acted like witnesses carrying heavy memories. Their voices cracked, their eyes widened, their hands trembled as they described the beings. Some cried during their testimonies. Others stared into the distance, their minds replaying the terrifying silence of those black eyes. For Mac, it was clear. Something had profoundly affected these children. He sat with them in small groups, sometimes one-on-one, and asked gentle questions. What did you see? How did you feel? Can you draw it for me? The children responded with honesty. They drew discs with domed tops, beings with large heads and narrow necks, eyes that seemed to pull them in. They described a sense of communication without words, thoughts placed directly into their minds. The most haunting message repeated again and again, a warning about the earth, about technology, about the environment. Mac documented everything. His training as a psychiatrist allowed him to look for signs of fantasy or hysteria, but he found none. Instead, he found sincerity, consistency, and trauma. These were not children making up ghost stories. These were children who had experienced something beyond their understanding. Other investigators joined as well. Cynthia Hind, a prominent UFO researcher in Africa, was among the first to take the children seriously. She gathered testimony, recorded interviews, and preserved drawings. Hind's presence brought credibility to the case within the UFO research community. She noted how the children's descriptions remained consistent even when separated and interviewed individually. Their stories aligned in ways that could not be explained by simple imagination. Local authorities also paid attention, though cautiously. Zimbabwe was a nation balancing modern influences with deep cultural traditions. Stories of spirits, ancestors, and omens were not uncommon. But UFOs? That was something new, something unsettling. Officials didn't want to inflame panic, but neither could they silence the story. The arrival of respected investigators like Hind and Mac meant the event had to be taken seriously, at least as a psychological and cultural phenomenon. The investigators faced their own challenges. Skeptics accused them of fueling hysteria. Journalists accused them of exploiting children for fame. Mac, in particular, was criticized back in the United States for his involvement, but he pushed forward, convinced that the Ariel School Encounter was one of the most important cases in the history of UFO research. Meanwhile, the children themselves felt the pressure of constant questioning. Investigators asked, reporters asked, parents asked. For some, repeating the story was healing. For others, it was exhausting. A few began to withdraw, tired of reliving the fear. But even in their silence, the drawings, the interviews, and the memories spoke for them. The investigators noticed something striking. While the details of the beings varied slightly, some children described shiny suits, others saw dark clothing, the emotional core never wavered. The beings had enormous eyes. They stared deeply. They communicated warnings. They left a lasting impression of fear and awe. That level of consistency across 60 children was unprecedented. Mac later reflected that the Ariel school children showed no signs of fabrication. Instead, they carried the psychological marks of witnesses to a trauma. And yet, it was not just trauma. Some children described a sense of wonder, even of privilege, at being chosen to see something so extraordinary. This duality, fear and fascination, was at the heart of the encounter. The arrival of investigators turned Ariel School into more than a playground. It became a case study, a field site, a place of pilgrimage for those seeking answers about life beyond Earth. Researchers walked the grounds, measured distances, recorded testimonies, and pored over every sketch. The children, meanwhile, simply tried to return to normal school life. But normal would never truly return. For weeks, investigators came and went. Some stayed only a day. Others spent longer, building trust with the children. They left with piles of notes, recordings, and drawings. What they also left with was a profound sense of mystery. The Ariel School Encounter did not provide neat answers. It raised more questions than it solved. But one thing was certain. Something extraordinary had happened on that September morning in 1994. Something powerful enough to leave 60 children trembling, sketching, and speaking with unwavering voices. Something powerful enough to draw investigators from across the world. The arrival of investigators ensured that the Ariel School encounter would never fade into obscurity. It transformed from a local mystery into a global case study, one that continues to puzzle, inspire, and haunt people decades later. The red soil of Rua now held not just the footprints of children, but the footsteps of journalists, researchers, and scientists, all chasing the truth of what happened when the sky came down to meet the playground. By the time whispers of the Ariel School UFO encounter had spread from dusty playgrounds in Rua to buzzing newsrooms in London, New York, and Johannesburg, one man thousands of miles away felt a deep pull toward Zimbabwe. His name was Dr. John Edward Mack, a Pulitzer Prize-winning Harvard psychiatrist. At first glance, he did not seem like someone who would be drawn into stories of UFOs. He was a respected academic, a man of science, trained to separate fantasy from fact. But John Mack was no ordinary psychiatrist. He had spent years studying people who claimed to have experiences with beings not of this earth, and unlike many of his colleagues, he listened with open ears and an open heart. When Dr. Mack heard of Ariel School, he recognized something unique. Most UFO cases involved adults, pilots, farmers, soldiers, people whose credibility was constantly questioned. But here was a case with over 60 children as witnesses. Children had little to gain from lying, and their innocence made their words harder to dismiss. For Mack, this was not just another case. This was perhaps the most important evidence yet that humanity was touching something beyond itself. So in late 1994, Mack boarded a plane and traveled across the Atlantic. The journey itself felt symbolic. A Harvard professor leaving the polished halls of Cambridge, Massachusetts, to sit with barefoot children in a small school in rural Zimbabwe. When his plane touched down, he carried notebooks, recording equipment, and above all, a deep sense of curiosity. The first time Mack walked onto the grounds of Ariel School, he noticed the quiet energy that still lingered. The red soil, the low classrooms, the bush at the edge of the playground. It was all ordinary and yet extraordinary, because here, on this very spot, the children had seen something that shook their world. He could almost feel the weight of their memories in the air. Mack did not rush. He spent time with the teachers, the headmistress, and parents. He wanted to understand the setting before hearing the stories. Then slowly, he began speaking with the children in small groups. He used his training as a psychiatrist not to interrogate, but to invite trust. His questions were gentle. What did you see? How did you feel? Can you draw it for me? The responses stunned him. One by one, children described the same things: a round silver craft landing near the bush, small beings with large heads and enormous dark eyes, and a silent form of communication that reached into their minds. Some described messages about the earth, warnings that humans were destroying nature with technology. Others focused on the terrifying stillness of those eyes. What impressed Mack most was the emotional truth of the children. He watched their body language. He noted their trembling voices. He saw the tears welling in their eyes as they relived the moment. These were not children spinning stories for fun. They were witnesses, struggling to explain the unexplainable. One girl's testimony left him shaken. She spoke softly, her hands twisting nervously. "He looked at me," she said, describing the being. "He said, not with his mouth, but in my head, that the earth is in danger, that we must take care of it." Mack leaned in, asking gently, "How did that make you feel?" The girl's eyes filled with tears. "Scared," she whispered, "because I don't know how to help." For Mack, this was profound. These were not children talking about space battles or aliens from TV shows. These were children conveying deep moral and ecological concerns far beyond their age. They spoke of technology running out of control, of forests dying, of a planet in peril. And they spoke with the seriousness of witnesses delivering warnings, not fantasies. As days turned into weeks, Mack conducted dozens of interviews. He recorded the children on video, capturing their faces as they spoke. Those recordings would later become some of the most powerful pieces of evidence in the case. Watching them, even decades later, one sees not actors, but ordinary children reliving an extraordinary moment. Mack's academic training forced him to consider every possibility. Could this be mass hysteria? Could the children be influenced by one another's stories? Could cultural myths have shaped their perceptions? He tested these ideas carefully. He interviewed the children separately. He checked their consistency. He compared their stories to one another. And while small details differed, two beings instead of one, silver clothing versus black, the core never changed. They all described the same craft, the same beings, the same unspoken communication. He also examined their psychological profiles. None showed signs of mental illness or delusion. None had histories of fabricating elaborate lies. Their stories carried the hallmarks of trauma, not invention. For Mack, the conclusion became unavoidable. These children experienced something real. When Mack shared his findings, controversy erupted. Some of his Harvard colleagues accused him of abandoning scientific rigor. Others mocked him for entertaining the idea of extraterrestrials. But Mack stood firm. He argued that dismissing the children's testimony simply because they challenged our worldview was unscientific. Science, he said, must follow evidence, even when it leads into uncomfortable territory. In public lectures, Mack spoke passionately about Ariel School. He described the sincerity of the children, their unwavering consistency, and the profound messages they claimed to have received. He argued that whether or not the beings were aliens in the traditional sense, the experience was real in the children's minds and demanded respect. He challenged skeptics to sit with the children themselves, to look into their eyes, and then dare to call them liars. His involvement elevated the Ariel School Encounter from a local story to an international case study. With Harvard's name attached, journalists and researchers took the story more seriously. Documentaries began to feature the interviews. Scholars debated the meaning. The children of Ariel School, once dismissed as imaginative kids, were now central figures in one of the most studied UFO encounters of the century. But Mack's role was not just that of an investigator. He became, in a way, a guardian of the children's truth. He defended them against ridicule. He amplified their voices. And he reminded the world that their innocence made them some of the most credible witnesses of all. Even years later, when Mack tragically died in 2004, his work at Ariel School remained a cornerstone of his legacy. His interviews were replayed in documentaries, his notes were cited in books, and his defense of the children stood as a challenge to skeptics everywhere. Sometimes the truth does not fit neatly into science, but it still deserves to be heard. The children of Ariel School never forgot him. For many, he was the first adult who truly listened, who believed, who did not dismiss their trembling voices as childish nonsense. He treated them with dignity, and in doing so, he preserved their experience for history. The arrival of John Mack at Ariel School was more than an investigation. It was validation. It was the moment when 60 frightened children, standing on a playground in Zimbabwe, found an ally in one of the world's most respected psychiatrists, and through him, their story became immortal. When stories spread, they usually change. Like whispers passed from one child to another in a game of telephone, details twist and blur until the final version sounds nothing like the first. But in the case of the Ariel School UFO Encounter, something astonishing happened. 60 children, different ages, different classes, different cultural backgrounds, all saw something extraordinary on that September morning in 1994. And when investigators, journalists, and psychologists began asking them what they saw, their answers lined up in ways that stunned even the most skeptical minds. At first, teachers and parents expected chaos. How could so many kids describe the same thing? Surely they would contradict one another. Surely the stories would fall apart under careful questioning, but they didn't. Time after time, child after child, the same images and feelings surfaced. A shining, disc-like craft descending near the bushland. Small beings with large heads and enormous dark oval eyes. Silent communication that felt more like thoughts than spoken words. A powerful sense of fear, awe, and warning. The consistency was not shallow. It went deep, down to the gestures, the emotions, even the pauses in their speech. Some children broke down crying as they recalled the eyes of the beings. Others grew wide-eyed, as though reliving the encounter in real time. Each child told their story in their own words, yet together they created a single, harmonious testimony, like different instruments playing the same melody. Investigators quickly realized this was not coincidence. When children are coached or influenced, their stories often sound rehearsed, but the Ariel children were anything but rehearsed. They spoke with the raw, unfiltered honesty of witnesses who had nothing to prove and nothing to gain. If one child said the craft hovered above the bushes, another confirmed it without hesitation. If one child drew a being with an oversized head and skinny arms, dozens of others produced nearly identical drawings. Dr. John Mack paid special attention to this. As a psychiatrist, he had seen many cases where children exaggerated, fantasized, or borrowed details from friends. But in Rua, the details flowed naturally and consistently, even when the children were separated and interviewed alone. Mack found this striking. If they had been making it up, their stories should have diverged. But they didn't. One girl described the being's eyes as big and black, like pools that don't end. Another boy, interviewed separately, said, "The eyes were scary, very big. They were looking at me, like into me." Neither child heard the other's description, yet their words carried the same haunting truth. Investigators also noticed that the children's drawings, though simple, echoed the same shapes. Page after page showed domed discs, small figures with spindly limbs, and large heads with dominating eyes. No two drawings were exactly the same, because no two perspectives were the same, but the essence remained identical. When shown side by side, the drawings became a kind of visual chorus, each one adding weight to the others. Cynthia Hind, one of the first investigators, kept many of these drawings, and to this day, they remain some of the most compelling pieces of evidence. For skeptics, it was hard to believe that so many children could invent the same images without some form of external influence. Parents, too, noticed the consistency. Children from different homes told their families the same story. At night, dinner tables across Rua echoed with frightened voices describing the craft, the beings, the eyes. Some parents were unsettled, others dismissive, but few could ignore the sincerity with which their children spoke. What made the testimonies even more remarkable was the emotional consistency. These were not just flat descriptions of strange shapes. They carried feelings, fear, awe, and an unshakable sense of urgency. Many children spoke of a message or warning they felt inside their heads. Some said it was about the earth, about humans destroying nature, about technology moving too fast. These were not themes young children in rural Zimbabwe typically discussed, yet they surfaced again and again, unprompted, across dozens of interviews. The investigators tested the children in subtle ways. They asked the same questions in different forms to see if the answers shifted. They asked about details that could trip up a lie. They interviewed children separately, far from their peers, to avoid contamination. And still, the stories aligned. The beings were small. The craft was shiny. The eyes were overwhelming. The message was clear. Humans must change their ways. For Dr. Mack, this consistency became one of the strongest arguments that the Ariel School case was authentic. He knew that skeptics would claim it was mass hysteria, or that children had influenced one another. But hysteria usually creates chaos, not harmony, and influence usually creates shallow repetition, not deep emotional coherence. What Mack saw was something different. 60 unique voices, all pointing toward the same astonishing event. Over time, even journalists who arrived with doubt began to acknowledge the strength of the children's testimonies. A reporter from the BBC noted that the children spoke with such seriousness it was impossible to laugh. A television crew filmed their wide, unblinking eyes, their trembling hands, their earnest attempts to explain the unexplainable. The footage spread worldwide, and viewers thousands of miles away felt the same chill. These children believed what they were saying, and they believed it with all their hearts. Years later, when some of the children had grown into adults, they were interviewed again. What shocked investigators was not how much their stories had changed, but how little. Decades had passed, yet they still described the same craft, the same beings, the same eyes. Some admitted they had tried to bury the memory, to live normal lives, but the images haunted them. "It never went away," one woman said. "It's like it happened yesterday." The consistency stretched not only across individuals, but across time. This gave the case a rare permanence. Childhood fantasies usually fade, but the Ariel School memories remained etched in the minds of those who lived them. That persistence gave researchers more confidence that the testimonies were genuine. Skeptics still tried to dismiss it. They argued that children could share stories quickly, that imagination spreads like wildfire. But when shown the footage of the interviews, raw, unedited, emotional, even skeptics admitted the sincerity was difficult to ignore. The trembling lips, the tears, the desperate hand gestures, these were not the marks of rehearsed liars. They were the marks of children burdened by something bigger than themselves. The consistent testimonies of the Ariel School children became the backbone of the entire case. Without them, the story would have faded as just another strange rumor. With them, it became one of the most powerful UFO encounters in history. Each testimony was a thread, and together they wove a tapestry too strong to dismiss. Decades later, when documentaries revisited the case, they always returned to those testimonies. The drawings, the videos, the transcripts, they remained timeless, untouched by exaggeration or invention. The children spoke, and their voices still echo, carrying the same unshakable harmony that made the world pause in 1994. In the end, the Ariel School case is not just about UFOs, it is about truth. The truth that 60 children, innocent and sincere, can stand together and describe something extraordinary with a consistency that defies dismissal. It is about voices too young to manipulate, too honest to corrupt, and too powerful to ignore. The playground may have been small, but the echoes of those testimonies reached across the globe, reminding humanity that sometimes the most consistent truths come from the mouths of children. For every story that inspires belief, there is another that demands doubt. The Ariel School UFO Encounter was no exception. While the children of Rua spoke with trembling voices and drew pictures of large-eyed beings, skeptics around the world shook their heads. To them, it was not evidence of extraterrestrial visitors. It was evidence of how easily human minds, especially young ones, could be fooled. From the very beginning, critics argued that the case was built on shaky ground. Children are imaginative, they said. They play, they exaggerate, they copy one another. In classrooms everywhere, children often repeat the same stories. Ghosts in the hall, monsters in the dark, creatures under the bed. Why should this case be any different? 60 children, skeptics claimed, could easily have influenced one another, turning a simple sighting into a grand tale of UFOs and aliens. One of the strongest skeptic theories was mass hysteria. Psychologists explained that when one child cries out in fear, the emotion can spread like wildfire. The human brain is wired to pick up on group signals, especially in children. If one child points to the sky and screams about a spaceship, others might quickly convince themselves they see it too. Soon, the entire group believes the same story, even if only one child truly thought they saw something unusual in the first place. Another theory was misinterpretation. Zimbabwe's skies are full of natural wonders, shining planets, unusual cloud formations, satellites gliding silently across the night, and even aircraft reflecting the sun at strange angles. Could the children have simply seen something ordinary, like a plane or a weather balloon, and mistaken it for a UFO? Their young imaginations could have filled in the rest, creating beings where none existed. Skeptics also pointed to the cultural climate of the 1990s, just before the Ariel School sighting. There had been a wave of UFO interest around the world. In the United States, television shows and movies like The X-Files and Close Encounters of the Third Kind had made aliens a popular topic. News headlines often carried reports of UFOs and abductions. Even in Zimbabwe, stories traveled by radio and newspapers. Could the children have absorbed these cultural images and replayed them in their own way? The large black eyes, the disc-shaped craft, these were already part of the global imagination of aliens. Skeptics believed the children were simply repeating what the world had already taught them. Then there was the issue of suggestion. Once the first child described a being, investigators, parents, and journalists began asking others, "Did you see it too?" Even subtle cues, raised eyebrows, shocked gasps, leading questions could have shaped the children's memories. Over time, their testimonies might have become more consistent, not because they were true, but because their brains had adjusted to match the expectations around them. Memory is not a perfect recording. It is flexible, fragile, and often shaped by outside influence. Prominent skeptics wasted no time voicing these arguments. Richard Dawkins, a well-known evolutionary biologist, dismissed the case, suggesting that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and children's drawings and shaky testimonies were far from extraordinary proof. Other scientists echoed his thoughts. Where was the physical evidence? Where were the burned patches of ground, the strange metals, the radar blips? If a spaceship had truly landed, surely it would have left behind more than just frightened faces and sketches in pencil. Journalists also played their part. Some mocked the story as another African UFO fantasy. Headlines carried a tone of disbelief, sometimes even ridicule. Cartoonists drew aliens chasing schoolchildren, and radio hosts laughed on air, asking listeners if they had seen any green men lately. For skeptics, the case was less about extraterrestrials and more about human psychology and gullibility. Dr. John Mack, of course, defended the children, but skeptics turned their criticism toward him as well. They accused him of being biased, of wanting to prove his own theories about extraterrestrial contact. Some even suggested that Mack's presence might have unintentionally encouraged the children to strengthen their stories. When a Harvard professor comes all the way from America to ask about aliens, one critic wrote, what child wouldn't want to give him a good story? Even within Zimbabwe, not everyone believed. Some teachers at the school admitted they had not seen anything themselves, and they were cautious about confirming the children's version. Parents, too, were divided. While some trusted their children's honesty, others dismissed the incident as overactive imagination. For skeptics, the lack of adult witnesses was a major weakness. If something so dramatic really happened, they asked, why didn't a single adult see it? Skeptics also examined the so-called messages the children received from the beings. Warnings about technology, the environment, and the Earth's future seemed far too convenient. These were the very topics adults had been discussing in the media throughout the 1990s. Deforestation, pollution, overpopulation. Was it really a message from aliens, or simply echoes of what the children had overheard at home and in school? Yet for all their arguments, skeptics struggled with one thing: the raw sincerity of the children's testimonies. Watching the interviews, even hardened critics admitted the children seemed genuinely disturbed. Their wide eyes, their trembling voices, their tears. It was difficult to dismiss these as simple play acting. Still, skeptics argued that sincerity is not the same as truth. People can be sincerely mistaken. Groups can be sincerely misled. Children, especially, can sincerely believe in things that never happened. In the years after the encounter, skeptics continued to circle the story like vultures. Every time documentaries or articles highlighted the Ariel School case, critics reminded audiences of the alternative explanations: hysteria, suggestion, cultural influence, misinterpretation. They demanded physical evidence, and in its absence, they dismissed the case as folklore. And yet, the Ariel case refused to die. For every skeptic who dismissed it, there was a researcher who defended it. For every article that mocked it, there was another that treated it with respect. The skeptics' voices were loud, but they could not drown out the children's. In the end, the skeptics' view became an inseparable part of the Ariel School story. Their doubts forced believers to sharpen their arguments, to gather testimonies more carefully, to defend the children with more passion. Without the skeptics, the story might have become unquestioned myth. With them, it became a battleground between belief and doubt, between innocence and analysis, between mystery and science. And so, even today, when the Ariel School encounter is discussed, skeptics still stand on one side of the playground, pointing out the holes, the missing evidence, the fragile minds of children. On the other side stand the believers, pointing to the trembling voices, the consistent drawings, the haunting memories. Between them lies the mystery, unsolved, unshaken, and unforgettable. For a child, the world is usually simple. School is about lessons, friends, games, and dreams. The sky is for clouds, the ground for running, and the future feels endless and bright. But for the children of Ariel School, one September morning in 1994 tore through that simplicity and left behind scars and questions they would carry for the rest of their lives. At first, the emotional impact was immediate: fear, shock, and confusion. When the shining craft descended near the bush and the strange beings emerged, the children's faces froze with terror. Many described their hearts racing, their legs wanting to run but unable to move. Some screamed and fled to the safety of the playground center. Others stood rooted, transfixed by those black, endless eyes. That moment etched itself deeply into their young minds. Fear was the strongest emotion. The beings were not like people. Their heads were too large, their bodies too thin, their movements too unnatural. Worst of all were the eyes. Child after child later described the eyes as if they were alive, pulling them inward, searching their souls. The fear was not just of something strange, it was primal, the kind of fear that grips the heart when confronted with the unknown. Even years later, many children still shivered when recalling those eyes. But fear was not the only feeling. Alongside it came awe. Some children spoke of being frozen not because they were terrified, but because they felt overwhelmed, as though they were standing in the presence of something far greater than themselves. A few even described a strange sense of calm or curiosity, as if the beings carried not only warnings, but also a kind of silent wisdom. This mix of emotions, terror and wonder, created confusion that was difficult for young minds to untangle. In the days after the encounter, the playground became a place of whispers and nervous glances. Dren huddled together, repeating the story, sketching the craft, trying to make sense of what had happened. Some cried at night, waking their parents with nightmares. Others refused to go near the bush again, fearing the beings might return. A few avoided the playground altogether, their once joyful space now forever tainted by the memory of the encounter. For some, the emotional impact took the form of guilt and helplessness. The messages they felt, the warnings about Earth, about technology, about caring for the planet, were heavy burdens for young shoulders. How could a 10-year-old be expected to carry the responsibility of saving the Earth? Several children later said the being's message made them feel both special and terrified. Special because they had been chosen to hear it, and terrified because they didn't know how to act on it. Teachers and parents tried to comfort them, but the emotional storm could not be easily calmed. Adults could tell them it was nothing, or it was just your imagination, but the children knew what they had seen and felt. Dismissing their experience often made it worse, leaving them isolated with memories too big to share. For many, the fear was not only of the beings, it was also of not being believed. The emotional impact stretched far beyond childhood. Decades later, when some of the children had grown into adults, they still carried the encounter inside them. In interviews, many admitted the memory had never faded. Some described it as the most vivid moment of their lives, sharper than birthdays, sharper than school achievements, sharper even than family milestones. It was like a scar on the mind, always there, always raw. Some adults admitted they still had nightmares, dreams of being watched, of large eyes staring, of strange figures moving silently at the edge of vision. For a few, the dreams carried the same messages, warnings about the Earth, reminders of the encounter, like echoes repeating through the years. These recurring visions kept the memory alive, whether they wanted it or not. Others spoke of how the encounter shaped their worldview. Some grew deeply spiritual, believing the beings were messengers not of another planet, but of another dimension, or even of a divine order. Others became more practical, dedicating their lives to environmental causes, inspired by the warnings they felt as children. And yet, there were also those who struggled with anxiety, distrust, and fear of ridicule. The encounter had given them something extraordinary, but it also set them apart from others. The emotional impact was not uniform. Each child carried it differently. For some, it was trauma, fear of the unknown, fear of not being believed, fear of the dark. For others, it was inspiration, an awakening to a bigger universe, a sense that they were part of something cosmic. But for all, it was unforgettable. Investigators like Dr. John Mack recognized this. When he interviewed the children, he didn't just hear their words, he felt their emotions. He saw tears stream down their cheeks as they relived the moment. He noted the way their voices trembled, the way their small hands clutched pencils tightly while sketching the beings. These were not children performing for attention. These were children processing a life-changing emotional event. Psychologists later debated whether the encounter itself caused trauma, or whether the reaction of adults, the disbelief, the ridicule, The endless questions amplified it. Some suggested that the interviews themselves, though well-intentioned, forced the children into relive the fear too many times. Others argued the opposite, that being allowed to speak openly helped the children release some of the weight they carried. But what could not be denied was the authenticity of the emotional impact. Even skeptics admitted the children seemed genuinely affected. They might disagree on the cause, whether it was real beings, a shared illusion, or a trick of the mind, but they could not deny the tears, the shaking hands, the sleepless nights. Something had happened to those children, something powerful enough to leave marks that lasted decades. The emotional ripple spread to families as well. Parents saw their children change overnight, becoming quieter, more thoughtful, or more anxious. Some parents worried about the psychological strain. Others encouraged their children to forget, to move on. But forgetting was impossible. The encounter had carved itself into their hearts. Even today, when the Ariel School witnesses speak as adults, their emotions remain raw. Their voices crack as they recall the day. Their eyes widen as though seeing it all again. The feelings of fear, awe, and helplessness return as strong as ever. For them, it is not just a childhood story. It is a wound and a gift, a burden and a mystery. The emotional impact of the Ariel School encounter shows us something profound. Whether or not the beings were real, the children's experiences were real. The fear was real. The awe was real. The tears were real. And the memories remain real, unshaken by time. The encounter was not just a story in the sky. It was a story in the hearts of children, etched so deeply that even adulthood cannot erase it. When the children of Ariel School in Zimbabwe ran home to tell their parents about what they had seen, most of them believed they were describing something unique, something that could only have happened in their playground. But what none of them realized at the time was that their story was part of a much larger picture. Around the world, from the deserts of America to the forests of Brazil, people were reporting similar encounters. The Ariel incident was not isolated. It was a thread woven into the fabric of a global mystery. To understand this connection, we need to step back and look at the world in the 1990s. UFO sightings had been reported for decades, but in the years leading up to 1994, the phenomenon seemed to intensify. Governments, journalists, and scientists were all being forced to take notice. The Ariel School sighting happened in a global environment where the idea of extraterrestrials was not just a fantasy, it was a question millions were asking seriously. Take, for example, the United States, where UFO culture was at its peak. In the 1940s and 1950s, sightings had already captured the imagination of the public, with famous cases like Roswell in 1947. By the 1990s, the UFO conversation had evolved. Shows like The X-Files filled television screens with stories of abductions, government cover-ups, and mysterious lights in the sky. Talk shows invited people who claimed to have been taken aboard alien craft. Newspapers regularly published reports of strange sightings. So when the Ariel case broke out of Zimbabwe and reached global media, it immediately resonated with audiences who were already primed to believe, or at least to wonder. But the connection was not only cultural. In the very same year as the Ariel incident, other UFO sightings were being reported across continents. In South Africa, just weeks before the Ariel encounter, people described unusual objects in the skies. In Europe, strange aerial lights and craft-like objects were recorded in news archives. Even in the Americas, reports of hovering disks and silent triangular objects were on the rise. To UFO researchers, the Ariel case seemed to fit into a wave, a global pattern that could not be ignored. One of the most striking global connections came from the details. The children described beings with large, black, almond-shaped eyes, thin bodies, and almost human-like forms. This was not unique to Zimbabwe. Across the world, from the famous abduction accounts of Betty and Barney Hill in the U.S. to encounters in South America, the same description had emerged again and again. Researchers called these entities greys, and the fact that children in rural Zimbabwe, who had limited exposure to Western media, were describing the same figures as people thousands of miles away, gave the case an extraordinary weight. Skeptics, of course, argued the opposite. They said the images of aliens had already spread worldwide through movies, magazines, and rumors. Even if the children hadn't seen the X-Files, they might have absorbed these archetypes indirectly. Yet, defenders of the Ariel case pushed back, pointing out the specific consistency of the testimonies. The children didn't just repeat cliches, they described the way the beings moved, the way their eyes felt, as if they were pulling into the children's minds, and even the emotional messages they transmitted. These details matched eerily with stories told in completely different parts of the world. The Ariel incident also connected to another major theme in global UFO reports: messages of warning. In the United States, abductees often spoke of aliens showing them visions of environmental collapse, nuclear war, or technological dangers. In Brazil, witnesses told of beings warning humanity to take care of the Earth, NI. In Zimbabwe, children said they were warned about humans ruining the planet. This thematic connection stretched across continents, across cultures, across languages. It was as if the same message was being delivered to humanity in different places, through different witnesses. Beyond personal stories, governments themselves had a stake in the UFO mystery. The 1990s were a time when several governments began quietly releasing documents related to UFOs. In the United States, declassified files revealed that the Air Force had investigated thousands of sightings through its Project Blue Book. In France, a government body called GPAN openly studied UFOs. Even in South America, military officials occasionally admitted to tracking unidentified craft on radar. Against this backdrop, the Ariel School sighting was not just a children's fantasy, it was another puzzle piece in a much larger global mystery that even governments were quietly acknowledging. Researchers also pointed to the geographical spread of sightings. UFO encounters were not limited to high-tech nations. From rural villages in Africa to isolated islands in the Pacific, stories of strange lights and beings appeared again and again. The Ariel case, happening in Zimbabwe, reinforced this universality. It was not a story that could be dismissed as Western media influence alone. The phenomenon, whatever it was, did not respect borders. The global connection also revealed itself in how the story was received. When Western media picked up the Ariel case, audiences around the world immediately linked it to their own cultural experiences. In America, people compared it to Roswell and abduction stories. In Europe, it was framed as another example of unexplained aerial phenomena. In South America, it was welcomed as a confirmation of what many already believed, that we were not alone. As documentaries and articles spread the Ariel story, the case began to inspire new generations of UFO enthusiasts. Worldwide, conferences, books, and television specials often featured the Ariel children as key witnesses in the larger puzzle. The image of uniformed school children in rural Africa, describing beings with large eyes, became one of the most powerful symbols in UFO research. A reminder that the phenomenon was not limited to one culture or one corner of the globe. The Ariel case also strengthened the scientific challenge. If children in Zimbabwe describe the same beings and craft as adults in the US and Europe, then either humanity's collective imagination was strangely synchronized or something truly global was happening. Psychologists, sociologists, and anthropologists all wrestled with this question. Were these stories evidence of a shared myth or evidence of a shared reality? Even today, the Ariel School incident remains a cornerstone in global UFO discussions. Whenever new sightings are reported, in Chile, in Canada, in Japan, researchers often point back to Ruwa, Zimbabwe, as one of the most compelling moments in modern history. It is cited in conferences, documentaries, and even academic papers as a rare case where dozens of child witnesses, far from the usual centers of UFO lore, told a story that matched what people around the world had been describing for decades. The global UFO connection makes the Ariel School Encounter more than a local event. It transforms it into a piece of a worldwide phenomenon, a mystery that crosses borders, cultures, and generations. Whether one believes in extraterrestrials or not, the Ariel incident reminds us that humanity across the globe shares experiences of the unknown. And in that shared mystery lies both fear and wonder, skepticism and belief, science and imagination. For the children of Zimbabwe, the encounter was personal. For the world, it became universal. The playground in Ruwa was not just a place where 60 children saw something strange. It was a stage where the global UFO mystery revealed itself once again. Time has a strange way of changing everything, yet leaving the deepest memories untouched. For the children of Ariel School, the playground encounter of 1994 never truly faded. It followed them into their teenage years, into adulthood, into marriages, jobs, and parenthood. And then, decades later, life brought them back together. The reunions, whether in person, on camera, or in spirit, were not just about seeing old classmates. They were about facing the memory that had bound them forever. When filmmakers and researchers began revisiting the Ariel School case in the 2000s and 2010s, they sought out the children who had grown into adults. Some had stayed in Zimbabwe, others had moved abroad, to England, to Canada, to Australia, to South Africa. They had built new lives, but when contacted, nearly all of them remembered that morning in vivid detail. What was most surprising was not that they remembered, but that their memories had hardly changed. The reunions often began with cautious smiles. Old classmates hugged each other, laughing about how much time had passed. But as soon as the conversation turned to that day, the atmosphere shifted. Faces grew serious, voices lowered. Some even had tears in their eyes. It was as if no time had passed at all. The memory pulled them back to the playground, to the shining craft, to the silent beings with large black eyes. One of the most powerful reunions was filmed for a documentary. Several of the now adult witnesses sat in a circle, recalling the events together. As they spoke, they nodded at each other's words, finishing one another's sentences, agreeing on the smallest details. The shape of the craft, the way the beings moved, the strange sense of communication without words. Their consistency, even decades later, stunned observers. Skeptics had claimed the children had influenced each other back in 1994. But what about now, as own men and women, separated for years, still telling the same story? The emotional weight of these reunions was enormous. Some witnesses admitted they had tried to bury the memory, to move on with life. But sitting together again, they realized how much the event had shaped who they had become. Some had grown cautious of technology, echoing the warnings they believed the beings had given them. Others had pursued careers in environmental work, teaching, or community leadership, subconsciously carrying the message forward. For a few, the reunion brought healing. They no longer felt alone in their memories. As children, many of them had been afraid to speak about what they saw, worried they would be mocked or disbelieved. But seeing their old classmates nod in agreement gave them validation. They were not crazy. They were not imagining things. They had shared an extraordinary moment together. Yet not all emotions were comforting. Some witnesses admitted that the reunion stirred old fears. Talking about the beings again, seeing their classmates' drawings, remembering the eyes, it brought back nightmares. One witness confessed that for years she had avoided even thinking about it, and now the memories were as sharp as ever. The reunion was both a blessing and a burden. These reunions also caught the attention of researchers. They noted that the consistency of the testimonies over decades was almost unheard of. Memories usually fade or change with time, but here, the details remained solid. This suggested that whatever the children experienced had made a profound and lasting mark, impossible to erase. The reunions also became a kind of global moment. When documentaries aired, people around the world saw not just frightened children from 1994, but thoughtful adults in the present, still wrestling with what they had seen. Their sincerity touched audiences deeply. For believers, it was confirmation that the case was genuine. For skeptics, it was at least undeniable that these people carried real, life-changing memories. One of the most touching moments came when a former student, now living abroad, returned to the Ariel School grounds. Standing in the same playground where the encounter happened, he grew quiet. The trees had grown, the buildings had changed, but the space was the same. He pointed to the bush where the beings had stood and whispered, "I can still see it. I can still feel it." Hat's sense of timelessness, the merging of past and present, was the essence of the reunions. Not every classmate chose to revisit the past. Some declined interviews, not wanting to relive the fear. Others worried about how speaking publicly might affect their careers or families. But even in their silence, the impact of the encounter was clear. Their choice not to speak was itself a testimony to how deeply the memory had shaped them. The reunions also showed the diversity of interpretations among the witnesses. Some remained convinced the beings were extraterrestrial visitors. Others thought they might have been spiritual entities or something beyond human understanding. A few admitted they still didn't know what they had seen, only that it was real and unforgettable. Despite these differences, the core story remained the same: a craft, beings, eyes, and a message. Years later, during these reunions, many of the witnesses expressed a shared wish that the world would finally take their story seriously. They were no longer children craving attention. They were adults with families, jobs, and responsibilities. They had nothing to gain by retelling their encounter. If anything, they risked ridicule. And yet they spoke. They reunited. They remembered. Because for them, the truth was too heavy to carry alone. The Ariel School reunions remind us that history is not just written in books or recorded in government files. Sometimes it lives in the hearts of people, carried across decades, passed from childhood to adulthood. When those hearts gather again, the story becomes alive once more. The reunions of Ariel witnesses were not just meetings of old friends. They were living proof that an extraordinary event had happened, an event that time could not erase and distance could not scatter. Legacies are not built in a day. They are built over time, through the weight of memory, the persistence of testimony, and the power of a story that refuses to fade. The Ariel School UFO Encounter of 1994 was more than a strange moment on a playground in Zimbabwe. It became a legacy, one that spread across continents, inspired generations, and continues to spark debate, research, and wonder decades later. When 60 children pointed to the sky and described beings unlike anything on Earth, the event instantly became unforgettable. But what happened afterward, the way the story grew, the way it traveled, the way it lingered, this is what carved the Ariel encounter into history. The legacy began with the children themselves. For them, the encounter was not just a childhood story, it was a defining moment. As they grew older, the experience shaped their worldviews, their careers, even their identities. Some became environmental activists, inspired by the warnings they believed they had received. Others carried the trauma quietly, avoiding the spotlight but forever changed inside. The legacy then spread to families and communities. Parents who once doubted their children found themselves confronted by testimonies too consistent to ignore. Teachers, journalists, and researchers who dismissed the story at first eventually admitted that something unusual had happened. Whether they believed in aliens or not, they could not deny the sincerity of the witnesses. And so, the Ariel encounter entered the local history of Zimbabwe, whispered in classrooms, discussed at dinner tables, remembered in the soil of Rua. But the impact did not stop at the borders of Zimbabwe. Internationally, the case became a cornerstone of UFO research. For investigators, the Ariel encounter stood out because of its scale and purity. Unlike many sightings, which involved only one or two witnesses, the Ariel event involved more than 60 children. Unlike many encounters clouded by alcohol, drugs, or nighttime confusion, this happened in broad daylight, with sober, innocent witnesses. Unlike reports that relied on memory years after the fact, this story was documented almost immediately, with interviews and drawings preserved for history. For UFO researchers, the Ariel case became a gold standard. It was cited in books, presented at conferences, and analyzed in documentaries. Investigators pointed to it as one of the strongest cases for the existence of extraterrestrial visitors, or, at the very least, for a phenomenon beyond conventional explanation. The consistency of the children's testimonies over decades became a powerful argument against the idea of mass hysteria or imagination. The legacy also touched the world of academia. Psychologists studied the case to understand how children process extraordinary experiences. Anthropologists examined it as an example of how global myths and local realities can intersect. Even philosophers engaged with it, asking what the Ariel encounter meant for humanity's place in the universe. The event became not only a UFO story, but also a subject of scholarly curiosity. In popular culture, the Ariel case left its mark as well. It appeared in television specials, books, and documentaries. Images of the children, their wide eyes, their trembling voices became iconic. For many, the Ariel encounter was their introduction to the possibility of UFOs. It stood as a reminder that the phenomenon was not limited to American deserts or military bases. It could happen anywhere, even in the playground of a rural school in Africa. The legacy was also deeply personal. For the witnesses themselves, the encounter became a thread woven through their entire lives. In reunions years later, they described how the memory shaped their choices, their fears, their beliefs. Some saw it as a blessing, proof that humanity was not alone. Others saw it as a curse, an event they could never fully explain, one that set them apart from others. Together, their voices created a chorus that echoed across time, ensuring the encounter would not be forgotten. Another layer of the legacy lies in the debate it sparked. The Ariel encounter forced believers and skeptics into dialogue. Believers pointed to the sincerity and consistency of the children. Skeptics pointed to the lack of physical evidence. This tension kept the story alive. Without skeptics, the case might have faded into unquestioned myth. Without believers, it might have been dismissed as childish imagination. Instead, it became a battlefield of ideas, a case that both sides returned to again and again. The Ariel encounter also left a spiritual legacy. Many of the children described the being's message as a warning about Earth's future. Whether real or imagined, this message resonated with global concerns about the environment and technology. In this way, the encounter became more than a UFO story. It became a moral story, a parable for humanity. Save the planet. Use technology wisely. Care for the Earth. The fact that these themes emerged from the mouths of children gave them a purity and urgency that struck people deeply. As decades passed, the legacy of the Ariel encounter grew stronger rather than weaker. New generations discovered the story through documentaries and articles. Researchers revisited the case with fresh eyes. And in 2020, when a documentary film brought the witnesses back together, the world was reminded once more of the power of their testimony. Their adult faces carried the same haunted sincerity as their childhood ones. The legacy lived on. The Ariel case also influenced how governments and media treated UFO stories. When the U.S. military began declassifying UFO videos in the 2000s and 2010s, researchers often mentioned Ariel as a reminder that unexplained encounters were not limited to pilots and soldiers. Ordinary people, especially children, had also experienced the unknown. The legacy of Ariel helped legitimize the broader conversation about UFOs, nudging it closer to mainstream acceptance. Ultimately, the legacy of the Zimbabwe UFO encounter is one of endurance. The story endured skepticism, ridicule, and the passage of time. It endured across continents and cultures. It endured in the memories of children who became adults, carrying their truth with them. And it continues to endure today, inspiring wonder, debate, and reflection. The Ariel School encounter was more than a fleeting mystery. It was a seed planted in history, growing roots in psychology, culture, spirituality, and science. Its legacy is not just about whether aliens visited a playground in 1994. It is about how a moment can ripple outward, touching lives, shaping conversations, and reminding humanity of its endless curiosity about the skies above. The legacy of Ariel is not finished. Every time the story is told, every time a new generation hears about those children in Zimbabwe, the legacy grows. It is a story that belongs not just to the witnesses, not just to Zimbabwe, but to the whole world. And perhaps, if the beings truly came from beyond our planet, it is a story that belongs to the universe itself. Every story has an ending, but some stories never truly end. They echo, they ripple, they live on in the minds of those who hear them. The Ariel School UFO Encounter is one such story. Almost 3 decades later, it continues to raise more questions than answers, and perhaps that is what makes it so powerful. As you, the viewer, sit and reflect on what you've just heard, ask yourself, what does it mean when 60 children describe the same extraordinary event? What does it mean when those children, now adults, still tell the same story with tears in their eyes, voices trembling, and memories that refuse to fade? Does it mean they truly saw something from beyond this world? Or does it mean that human imagination is far more complex and mysterious than we understand? The truth is, the Ariel School Encounter is not just about aliens or UFOs. It is about belief. It is about memory. It is about how we, as humans, deal with the unknown. For the children of Ariel, that morning in 1994 was more than an interruption of recess. It was a turning point. Their innocence collided with mystery, and their young minds were forced to carry an experience too heavy for their years. For some, the encounter became a spiritual awakening. They believed the beings were messengers, bringing wisdom from beyond. For others, it was a source of lifelong anxiety, a shadow they could not escape. For researchers, it was evidence, raw, rare, and precious. For skeptics, it was a puzzle, an example of how groups of people can create and sustain powerful shared beliefs. And for the rest of us, for those of us watching from the outside, the Ariel School Encounter is a mirror. It reflects our deepest hopes and fears. We hope that we are not alone, that there are greater beings out there watching us, perhaps guiding us. We fear the same, that if such beings exist, they may not come in peace, and their presence may remind us of our own smallness in the universe. The children's message, whether real or imagined, also holds weight for our world today. Warnings about technology, warnings about the destruction of Earth. These are not distant alien concerns. They are human concerns, urgent and immediate. In a way, the Ariel encounter becomes less about the visitors and more about ourselves. Are we listening to the warnings? Are we caring for our planet? Are we using our technology wisely? Some of you may finish this story convinced that the children of Ariel truly met beings from another world. Others may remain firmly skeptical, certain that the event was a blend of imagination, hysteria, and suggestion. Both reactions are valid because the Ariel case leaves room for both. It sits in that space between belief and doubt, between science and mystery, between the visible and the invisible. What cannot be denied is the impact. Decades later, we are still talking about it. Documentaries are still being made, researchers are still debating, witnesses are still remembering. A single morning in Zimbabwe became a story that crossed oceans, languages, and generations. That is legacy. That is power. So as you leave this story behind and return to your own life, consider this. What if the children were telling the truth? What if, for just a moment, the universe bent down and touched a schoolyard in Rua? What if the eyes that stared into theirs belonged to something not of this earth? And what if those eyes were not threatening, but pleading for us to take better care of the world we already have? Or perhaps the lesson lies elsewhere. Perhaps the Ariel School Encounter reminds us that the human mind is the greatest mystery of all, that our imaginations are vast enough to create beings, warnings, and stories that shape entire lifetimes. That belief itself, whether in God, in science, or in aliens, has the power to move hearts and change lives. The final thoughts belong not to researchers, not to skeptics, and not even to us. They belong to the witnesses, the children who stood in that playground, staring at the sky, frozen in fear and awe. They were there. They saw. They felt. Whether you believe them or not, their truth remains theirs, unshaken by time or doubt. And so, the Ariel School Encounter does not end with answers. It ends with a choice for you, the viewer, to decide what to take from it. Will you dismiss it as fantasy? Will you embrace it as proof? Or will you carry it, like the witnesses did, as a mystery, an invitation to wonder, to question, to imagine? The playground in Rua is quiet now. The children are grown. The trees have changed, the buildings repainted. But somewhere in that soil, in that sky, in that memory, the story still lies. Ves. And as long as it is told, as long as it is remembered, the Ariel School Encounter will never truly end. The final thought is this. Sometimes the most important stories are not the ones that give us answers, but the ones that give us questions. Questions that keep us looking up, keep us searching, keep us alive with curiosity. The Ariel Encounter is one such story. And maybe, just maybe, that is the greatest legacy it could leave.